around the middle of the 17th century, and extending well into the decades that followed. The landscape of the early settlements was defined primarily by silence and the slow, methodical imposition of structure upon a vast and unmeasured geography. Before there were complex bureaucracies or sprawling administrative centers, governance existed as a series of quiet, repetitive physical actions rooted in the immediate necessities of daily life. It was a time when the concept of order was not an abstract theory, but a tangible practice involving wood, stone, ink, and the careful measurement of land. The establishment of authority began not with speeches, but with the construction of a central gathering place and the opening of a leather-bound book. In these early years, the center of civic regulation was the meeting house. It stood, often unpainted and stark, at the geographical center of the community or on the highest available ground. The architecture was utilitarian, designed to withstand the weather rather than to impress the eye. The timbers were hand-hewn from local oak or pine, squared with broadaxes and adzes until they fit together with heavy interlocking joinery. The walls were clad in rough clapboards or shingles that darkened with age and exposure to the elements. There was no glass in the windows initially, only oiled paper that admitted a diffused, pale light. Later, when glass became available, it was thick, distorted, and set into lead cames that rattled slightly in the wind. Inside, the space was open and cavernous. The floor was made of wide planks, worn smooth by the scuffing of heavy leather boots. There was no source of heat. In the winter, the air inside was as cold as the air outside, preserving the wood and keeping the atmosphere still. Governance in this setting was a matter of attendance and endurance. The rhythm of political life followed the rhythm of the seasons. There were no daily sessions or constant streams of legislation. Instead, the order of the town was maintained through the town meeting, an event that occurred at specific intervals or when the need for a decision became unavoidable. The process began with the warrant. This was a document, written by the town clerk in a careful, legible hand, listing the articles to be discussed. The clerk would use a quill pen, cut from the feather of a goose or turkey, and ink mixed from soot, oak galls, and gum arabic. The ink was dark and permanent, biting into the fibers of the rag paper. The warrant was not distributed broadly, but was affixed to the door of the meeting house or a post near the tavern, where it would remain for a set number of days, exposed to the sun and rain, allowing any passerby to read the business of the coming week. The act of reading the warrant was slow. Men would stop on their way to the fields or the mill, standing before the weathered wood of the door deciphering the script. The articles concerned the mundane and essential maintenance of the community, the repair of a bridge, the allocation of funds for the schoolmaster, the control of livestock, the clearing of brush from the commons. There was no urgency in this communication. Information traveled at the pace of a walking man. Once the designated time had passed, the meeting would convene. The residents would gather in the unheated building, filling the wooden benches or pews. The seating often reflected a silent hierarchy of age and standing, but the function of the room was collective. A moderator was chosen to oversee the proceedings, a role defined by the ability to maintain a steady tempo and ensure that one voice did not drown out another. The room would be filled with the sounds of shifting weight on wood, the rustle of wool coats, and the low murmur of consultation. When the meeting was called to order, silence was expected. The governance of the town relied on the spoken word, recorded faithfully by the clerk. The clerk sat at a small table, separate from the benches, with the record book open before him. This book was the physical repository of the town's history and its laws. Every vote, every decision, and every appointment was transcribed onto its pages. The scratching of the pen was often the only sound in the room during the intervals between speeches. The clerk's duty was to capture the exact phrasing of the motions. If a road was to be laid out, the description of its path, from the great oak tree to the stone wall, then turning north to the creek, had to be precise. These words would determine the boundaries of property and movement for generations. The matters discussed were intensely practical. A significant portion of governance was dedicated to the management of animals. In a landscape without fences, livestock roamed freely, and the potential for disorder was high. The town appointed specific officers to manage this. The Hayward was responsible for fences and hedges, ensuring that they were kept in good repair to prevent cattle from damaging crops. The Hog Reeve was charged with the oversight of swine, ensuring they were properly ringed and yoked, a ring in the nose to prevent rooting in the soil, and a wooden yoke around the neck to prevent them from pushing through gaps in the fences. These roles were not honorary. They involved walking the perimeter of fields, inspecting the condition of rails and posts, and impounding stray animals in the town pound. The pound itself was a stone or wooden enclosure, a visible structure of the law where order was restored by confining the chaotic element until a fine was paid. Another essential figure in this system of order was the fence viewer. Disputes over boundaries were common, as the markers of land were often natural features that could shift or degrade over time. The fence viewer was called upon to arbitrate these disagreements. He would walk the line between two properties, carrying a measuring staff or a chain. He inspected the height and strength of the partition. A legal fence had to meet specific dimensions, often 4 feet high and sturdy enough to resist the weight of a pushing ox. If a stone wall had collapsed, or if a rail was rotted, the viewer would issue an order for its repair. This process was slow and deliberate. It involved standing in the fields, measuring the stones, and consulting the original deeds recorded in the clerk's ledger. The resolution was not achieved through heated argument, but through the application of established standards of measurement. The measurement of land itself was a foundational act of governance. The surveyor of highways and the lot layers were responsible for translating the abstract lines of ownership into physical reality. They used a gunter's chain, a tool consisting of 100 metal links, measuring exactly 66 feet in length. The heavy iron chain was dragged through the underbrush, over rocks, and across streams. 2 men would operate the chain, one pulling the leading end, the other holding the rear, calling out the tally as they progressed. They moved slowly, clearing branches with hatchets to ensure a straight line. The surveyor would note the bearings using a magnetic compass, often mounted on a simple tripod. The needle settled slowly, waiting for the vibration to cease before a reading could be taken. These measurements were then transferred to paper, creating a map of the settlement that brought a geometric order to the uneven terrain. Roads were not built by distant contractors, but were maintained by the residents themselves. This was known as the labor tax or statute labor. Every able-bodied man was required to dedicate a certain number of days each year to the repair of the highways. The surveyor of highways would determine when this work was to be done, usually in the periods between planting and harvest when the soil was workable but not frozen. The work involved shoveling gravel, filling ruts caused by wagon wheels, and clearing drainage ditches. It was heavy, rhythmic labor. The sound of metal shovels striking the earth and the grinding of cartwheels carrying fill echoed through the woods. This system ensured that the infrastructure of travel was maintained by those who used it, creating a direct link between the citizen and the stability of the public way. In the meeting house, the passage of time was marked not by a clock on the wall, but by the movement of sunlight across the floorboards. Meetings could last for hours, extending into the late afternoon. If the business was not concluded before dusk, candles would be lit. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat were brought out and placed in tin sconces or simple iron holders. They burned with a yellow, flickering flame and produced a distinct, heavy scent. The smoke would drift up into the rafters, adding another layer of soot to the darkening wood. Under this dim light, the moderator would continue to recognize speakers. The pace did not quicken with the setting sun. The aim was consensus or a clear majority, and the process of reaching it required patience. Arguments were presented, considered, and often tabled for future discussion if a resolution was not immediately apparent. The role of the constable was central to the execution of these decisions. The constable was the arm of the law in the village, carrying a black staff as a badge of office. His duties were manifold and required a constant presence in the community. He was responsible for collecting the rates, the taxes assessed on property and polls. This involved visiting each household, often multiple times, to gather the payment, which might be offered in currency, but more often in goods, bushels of wheat, cords of wood, or shillingworth of labor. The constable had to verify the quality of these goods, measure them, and arrange for their storage or transport. It was a logistical task of immense detail, requiring the maintenance of his own set of accounts. He also served the warrants, summoned juries, and ensured the peace was kept. In a society without a standing police force, the constable's authority relied on the community's respect for the office he held. He walked the roads, a visible reminder of the collective order. Beyond the town center, the organization of the settlement radiated outward. The layout of the fields was often determined by a system of commonage. In many early settlements, individuals owned house lots, but the grazing lands and woodlots were held in common. This required a strict system of management to prevent overuse. The town would vote on stinting the commons, limiting the number of cattle or sheep each family could graze based on the size of their landholding or their contribution to the town's wealth. This was a mathematical exercise, calculating the carrying capacity of the land and dividing it among the inhabitants. The dates for opening and closing the commons were set by the season. When the grass was ready in the spring, the herds were driven out. When the frost came, they were brought in. This cycle was repeated year after year, a governance of agriculture that ensured the survival of the herd and the sustainability of the pasture. The preservation of records was a constant concern. The clerk's book was vulnerable to fire, water, and vermin. It was often kept in a specialized box or a heavy wooden chest, sometimes locked. The paper itself was durable, made from linen and cotton rags, with a high pH that prevented it from yellowing and crumbling quickly, but the ink could fade if exposed to dampness. To counter this, important documents were sometimes copied in duplicate. If a deed was transferred, the seller and the buyer would both want a record, and the town would keep a third. The act of copying was manual and tedious. There were no shortcuts. Every word had to be written out again. The clerk's hand had to remain steady. A blot of ink could ruin a page, requiring the surface to be scraped with a knife and polished smooth with a piece of bone before the correction could be written. Within the meeting house, there was also a seating committee. This group of respected men was tasked with the delicate job of assigning seats in the meeting house for religious services, which often bled into the perception of secular rank. This was known as dignifying the seats. The committee would evaluate the age, wealth, and civic contribution of each resident and assign them a specific bench. The closer to the pulpit or the front of the room, the higher the status. This process was conducted with great gravity and often resulted in long, quiet deliberations. Lists were drawn up, revised, and finally posted. The physical arrangement of bodies in the space was a manifestation of the social order, a visual map of the community's hierarchy that remained static until the next receding, which might not happen for several years. The town also maintained a standard of weights and measures. A set of standard weights, brass or iron, was kept by the town sealer. These were the reference points for all commerce in the village. Once a year or upon request, the sealer would check the measures used by millers, merchants, and tavern keepers. He would compare their bushel baskets, their yardsticks, and their balance scales against the town standards. If a measure was found to be accurate, it was stamped with a mark, usually the initial of the town or a specific symbol. If it was light or short, it was destroyed or corrected. This ensured that a bushel of corn bought from a neighbor was the same quantity as a bushel of corn paid in taxes. It was a governance of fairness, enforced through the physical verification of tools. Even the ringing of the bell, if the meeting house possessed one, or the beating of a drum, was a regulated act. The sexton or a designated individual was paid to mark the time. In the absence of personal timepieces, the sound of the bell regulated the start of the meeting, the curfew, and the alarm in case of fire. The rope hung down in the vestibule of the meeting house, and the ringer had to pull it with a steady rhythm to produce a clear, carrying tone. The sound rolled over the fields and through the woods, a non-verbal command that drew the community together or signaled the end of the day's labor. It was an auditory boundary, defining the range of the settlement's organized life. As the decades passed, these systems became more entrenched. The piles of ledger books grew taller. The stone walls settled into the earth, covered in lichen. The roads were widened and packed down by the passage of countless wagons. Yet the fundamental nature of governance remained calm and methodical. It was not a distant force imposing its will, but a local routine of maintenance. It was the checking of the fence, the recording of the stray heifer, the voting of the tax, and the mending of the road. It was a design of order built from the bottom up, relying on the repetition of small, necessary acts to hold back the wilderness and sustain the community. The structure was visible in the straight lines of the surveyor's map and audible in the scratch of the clerk's pen. It was a governance of patience, waiting for the ink to dry, waiting for the snow to melt, and waiting for the meeting to come to a consensus. The quiet authority of the selectmen, a small group chosen to manage the town's affairs between meetings, functioned as the executive gear in this slow-moving machine. They met in private homes, often by the hearth, to review the accounts and prepare the business for the larger body. They drafted the warrants and communicated with the colonial legislature when necessary. Their correspondence was written on folded sheets of paper, sealed with red wax. The seal was pressed into the hot wax with a brass matrix, leaving a crisp impression. These letters were carried by post riders or trusted travelers, moving from town to town. The receipt of a letter was an event. The seal was broken, the paper unfolded, and the news from the capital or a neighboring settlement was read aloud. There was no instant reaction. The information was absorbed, discussed, and filed away for the next meeting. In this era, the concept of office was literal. It referred to the duty one performed, not a room one occupied. A man held the office of tithingman. His duty was to oversee the morals and orderliness of a specific neighborhood, usually consisting of 10 families. He walked his beat, ensuring that the Sabbath was observed and that there was no disorderly conduct in the households. He carried a staff, tipped with brass or sometimes a squirrel tail to wake sleeping congregants during long sermons. His governance was intimate and domestic. He knew the families he watched. He knew their routines and their struggles. His report was given to the town authorities, a verbal or written account of the social health of his sector. It was a system of mutual observation, where order was maintained by the proximity of neighbors and the oversight of a designated peer. The visual landscape of governance was also marked by the stocks and the pillory, usually located near the meeting house. These were wooden frames, heavy and solid, standing empty most of the time. They were static symbols of the consequences of disorder. They were not hidden away in a dungeon, but were placed in the most public square, integrated into the daily path of the residents. Their presence was a silent reminder of the statutes recorded in the clerk's book. They weathered along with the meeting house, their wood turning gray, a permanent fixture in the architectural arrangement of the town center. Water was another element that required governance. In settlements built near rivers or streams, the rights to water usage were critical. The mill, whether for grinding grain or sawing timber, relied on the flow of the river. The town had to regulate the height of the dam and the times when the water could be held back or released. This involved agreements on flowage, ensuring that the flooding caused by the mill pond did not ruin the upstream meadows of other farmers. Disputes over water levels were common and technical. They were resolved by committees viewing the high water marks on trees and rocks, measuring the flow, and determining a schedule that balanced the needs of the miller with the needs of the farmers. The sound of the water wheel turning was the sound of permitted industry, regulated by the consensus of the town. The archives of the town grew year by year. Bundles of receipts, tied with twine, were stored in the clerk's chest. Petitions from residents asking for land grants or tax abatements were folded and filed. These papers smelled of wood smoke and dampness. They were the physical residue of the governance process. To look back through them was to see the gradual expansion of the order. A new road commissioned in 1 year, a new schoolhouse built in the next, a revision of the boundary line in the third. The handwriting changed as one clerk was replaced by another, but the format remained consistent. The videlicet, the item, and the resolved were the linguistic pillars of the record. There was a profound stillness to this mode of government. It did not race to keep up with events. It moved at the speed of agriculture. Decisions were made when the harvest was in, when the mud had dried, or when the need was absolute. The silence of the meeting house when it was empty was as significant as the noise when it was full. It stood as a waiting vessel, a reserved space for the reinstatement of order. The dust motes dancing in the shafts of light from the high windows settled on the unused benches, undisturbed until the next warrant was posted on the door. The system was designed to be durable, repetitive, and local, creating a framework of stability that allowed the settlement to persist against the uncertainties of the frontier. By the time the 18th century had firmly established its rhythms, the organization of governance had expanded beyond the immediate confines of the village meeting house, extending its reach into the county seats and shire towns that served as the administrative hubs of the colonies. This layer of order was known as the Court of General Sessions of the Peace. It was a system that operated on a quarterly cycle, mirroring the 4 seasons of the agricultural year. The court did not sit continuously. Instead, it convened for a few days or weeks at specific intervals, typically March, June, September, and December, creating a predictable calendar of legal and administrative maintenance that drew men from the outlying hamlets to the central town. The physical setting for this higher level of governance was the courthouse. Unlike the multi-purpose meeting house, this structure was dedicated solely to the administration of the law. It was often a brick or substantial timber building, distinguished by a cupola or a more formal architectural symmetry. Inside, the division of space was rigid and symbolic. A wooden railing, known as the bar, separated the public from the officers of the court. Behind this barrier sat the justices of the peace, men of standing who wore plain, dark clothing and white bands at their necks. They sat on a raised bench, looking down upon the clerks, the attorneys, and the petitioners. The furniture was heavy, made of polished walnut or mahogany, designed to convey the weight of authority. There were no cushions. The atmosphere was one of solemnity and procedural rigor, dominated by the scratching of quills and the rustling of heavy parchment rolls. The primary function of the sessions was not merely to punish crime, but to regulate the infrastructure and commercial life of the county. One of the most detailed administrative tasks undertaken by the court was the licensing of houses of public entertainment, or ordinaries. The tavern was considered a public utility, essential for travelers, and its operation was strictly controlled. Once a year, tavern keepers had to appear before the justices to renew their licenses. They presented a certificate from the selectmen of their town attesting to their good character and the necessity of their establishment. The court stipulated the prices that could be charged for a meal, a night's lodging for a horse, and a pot of cider or beer. These rates were recorded in the court ledgers and were required to be posted clearly within the tavern itself. The regulation extended to the behavior within these establishments. The justices issued orders prohibiting unreasonable drinking and gaming. The tavern keeper was required to possess the physical capacity to host travelers, specifically bedding and stabling. The court clerk would record the issuance of the license in a massive folio, noting the name of the keeper, the location of the house, and the payment of the fee and bond. This bond was a financial guarantee, a sum of money pledged to the crown or the colony, which would be forfeited if the rules of the house were violated. The administration of these licenses created a paper trail that mapped the network of travel and accommodation across the region. Parallel to the Sessions Court was the quieter, yet equally pervasive system of the probate court. This was the governance of property after death. When a head of household died, the transmission of his material world to his heirs was a process of intense scrutiny and documentation. The court appointed appraisers, usually 3 respected neighbors, to visit the home of the deceased and create a true and perfect inventory of the estate. This was a physical audit of a life's accumulation. The appraisers moved room by room, from the parlor to the kitchen, to the chambers upstairs, and finally to the barn and outbuildings. They counted and valued everything. The resulting document, often a long scroll of paper formed by gluing sheets together, listed items with specific valuations in pounds, shillings, and pence. They recorded the number of feather beds and the quality of the ticking. They noted the weight of the pewter platters and the condition of the brass kettles. Iron pots, trammels, spinning wheels, and looms were inspected. In the linen chest, they counted the sheets, the napkins, and the pillow biers. Even the contents of the wardrobe, coats, breeches, hats, and buckles were itemized. The livestock in the barn was listed: the yoke of oxen, the milch cows, the shoats, and the mare. This inventory was not private. It was returned to the probate office, copied into the bound volumes by the Register of Probate, and became a permanent public record. It ensured that debts could be paid and that the widow's thirds, the portion of the real estate legally reserved for the surviving wife's use during her lifetime, were accurately calculated. The infrastructure of the county, particularly the bridges and the King's Highway, fell under the jurisdiction of the sessions. While towns maintained local roads, the major arteries connecting settlements were the concern of the county magistrates. If a bridge was washed out by a spring freshet, or if a road became impassable due to neglect, a presentment would be made to the court by the grand jury. The grand jury in this context acted as an investigative body for civic maintenance. They were sworn to inquire into all breaches of the law and defects in the county. When a presentment was made, the court would order the responsible town or district to effect repairs by a certain date. Often, a committee of viewers would be appointed to inspect a proposed new route or a disputed boundary. These men would travel to the site, riding on horseback, carrying their instructions from the court. They would walk the ground, observing the terrain, the swamps, and the hills, determining the most convenient path that caused the least damage to private land. They drafted a report, returning it to the next session of the court. This report would be read aloud, and if accepted, the court would issue a warrant for the road to be laid out. The process was deliberative and slow, often taking years from the initial petition to the final clearing of trees. The governance of the poor and the indigent was another complex system managed at the intersection of town and county authority. The overseers of the poor were town officials, but their actions were often reviewed or ratified by the courts. The primary mechanism for social welfare was the binding out of children and the support of the elderly or infirm within private households. There were no large institutions or almshouses in the rural areas. Instead, care was decentralized. The overseers would negotiate a contract with a family to take in a pauper for a year. The town would pay for the person's board, clothing, and medical needs. These expenses were itemized in the town's account books, to payment for Dr. Smith for attendance, to wood for the widow Jones, to framing a pair of shoes. For children of poor families or orphans, the system of indenture was the standard method of governance. This was a legal contract, signed and sealed, binding the child as an apprentice to a master until the age of majority, typically 21 for males and 18 for females. The indenture document followed a standard template, printed or handwritten. It stipulated the exchange. The master would provide food, lodging, clothing, and instruction in a trade such as husbandry, blacksmithing, or housewifery, and usually promised to teach the child to read and write. In return, the apprentice promised obedience, fidelity, and labor. The language was archaic and strict. He shall not commit fornication nor contract matrimony. At cards, dice, or any other unlawful game he shall not play. These papers were filed with the town or county clerks, creating a legal parentage where the natural one had failed. The preservation of order also relied on the specialized role of the sheriff. Unlike the town constable, the sheriff was a county officer, appointed by the governor and council. His authority spanned the entire shire. His duties were largely administrative and logistical. He was responsible for the custody of prisoners, but also for the transmission of executive orders from the capital to the towns. When an election for the colonial assembly was called, the sheriff received the precept, a formal command to hold the election, which he then distributed to the selectmen of the various towns. After the votes were cast and counted, the returns were sent back to the sheriff, who sealed them and delivered them to the capital. He acted as the conduit of political authority. The sheriff also managed the collection of debts that had been adjudicated in court. When a judgment was issued against a debtor, the sheriff was issued a writ of execution. This document commanded him to levy the debt from the goods, chattels, or lands of the debtor. If no goods could be found, the person could be committed to the jail. The jail itself was usually a small, secure building near the courthouse, often no more than a few rooms with barred windows and heavy oak doors reinforced with iron studs. The sheriff or a deputy served as the jailer, providing meals to the inmates, the cost of which was often charged back to the prisoner or their family. Another layer of this structured society was the militia. While ostensibly a military organization in times of peace, it functioned as a civic routine and a census of manpower. By law, every able-bodied male between certain ages, often 16 to 60, was required to be enlisted in the local company. The governance of the militia was maintained through training days, typically held 4 times a year. These were not wild gatherings but mandatory inspections. The clerk of the band was the administrative officer responsible for the roll call. On the appointed morning, the men would gather on the town common or a training field. The clerk would read the names from his ledger. Each man was required by statute to provide his own equipment. The law specified the kit in precise detail: a firelock musket in good working order, a priming wire, a worm for cleaning the barrel, a bayonet or sword, a cartridge box with a specific number of rounds of powder and ball, and a knapsack. The officers would move down the line, inspecting the equipment. A man found lacking a flint or with a rusted lock was fined. The fines were recorded by the clerk and collected to buy drums, colors, flags, or halberds for the sergeants. The drilling consisted of practicing the manual of arms, a series of standardized postures and movements for loading and firing the musket. Poise your firelock, cock your firelock, handle your cartridge. These commands were repeated until the motions were uniform. It was a governance of the body, instilling a collective discipline through synchronized movement. The written word was the glue that held these systems together. Paper was a valuable commodity, imported or made in scarce local mills. It was handled with care. Documents were often written on large sheets of foolscap, folded to create 4 pages. When a document was completed, it was often docketed. This involved folding the paper into a narrow bundle and writing a brief summary of its contents on the outside panel: the date, the parties involved, and the nature of the business. These bundles were then tied with red fabric tape or linen string and stored in pigeonholes in the desks of the clerks. Over time, the paper would dry and crackle, the ink turning from black to a rusty brown due to the iron content. To dry the ink during writing, clerks used pounce, a fine powder made from ground sand or cuttlefish bone, kept in a shaker pot. The grit of the sand would remain on the document, a tactile memory of the moment of writing. The administrative year was also marked by the assessment of taxes. This was separate from the town rates discussed previously. This was the provincial or colony tax. The treasurer of the colony would send a warrant to the town assessors specifying the town's portion of the total tax burden. The assessors were then required to create a new list. They would take the invoice of the town. This involved listing every poll taxable person and every rateable estate. The definitions of rateable estate were complex and detailed in the tax laws. Horses 3 years old and upward, oxen 4 years old and upward, swine 1 year old and upward, acres of tillage, acres of meadow, vessels, trading stock and mills. The assessors had to apply a specific value to each category. The resulting list was a mathematical model of the town's wealth. It was posted for inspection, allowing residents to complain if they felt they were overcharged. The process of abatement, reducing taxes for those who had suffered a loss, such as a cow dying or a barn burning, was a formal petition process heard by the assessors or the selectmen. In the coastal towns, governance included the regulation of the maritime trades. The color of fish and the color of staves were officials elected to inspect export products. Salted fish, packed in barrels for shipment, had to be sorted by quality to ensure the reputation of the colony's trade. The color would open the barrels, inspect the fish, and brand the cask with a mark indicating its grade, merchantable or refuse. Similarly, barrel staves, the wooden slats used to make barrels, had to meet strict dimensional standards. They were measured for thickness and length. If they were too thin or made of sapwood, they were rejected. This quality control was a form of economic governance, protecting the collective market by policing the individual producer. Even the extraction of resources was subject to permit and oversight. The cutting of timber on common lands was restricted. Laws protected certain trees, often white pines of a certain diameter, reserved for the masts of the Royal Navy. The surveyor of woods was an official tasked with marking these trees with the broad arrow, a symbol of the crown's ownership. To cut such a tree without a license was a serious offense, punishable by heavy fines. This introduced a layer of imperial governance into the deep woods, where a mark on a tree trunk signified a distant authority that superseded local usage. The flow of information between these various levels, town, county, and colony, relied on the post. The post was not yet a daily service for the common man, but a government route for official intelligence. The post rider was exempt from certain duties like militia training to ensure his mobility. He carried the mail in saddlebags, riding a relay system. The arrival of the post at the tavern or the exchange station was a moment of convergence. Newspapers, which began to circulate in the larger towns, were carried by these riders. The reading of the newspaper was often a communal act in the tavern. One man would read aloud the shipping news, the acts of the assembly, and the foreign intelligence to a quiet room of listeners. This shared information formed the basis of public knowledge, a slow dissemination of the state of the world that took weeks or months to travel from the source to the listener. The courtroom, the ledger book, the inventory, the militia roll, and the branded barrel. These were the instruments of a society obsessed with defining and recording its own boundaries. It was a world where every object and every person had a classification and a place in the record. The quiet scratching of the quill in the county clerk's office was the sound of civilization asserting itself against the disorder of time and nature. The rows of docketed papers in the pigeonholes grew, year after year, a silent, dusk-gathering testament to the belief that order could be written down, filed, and preserved. As the 18th century deepened and the networks of settlement became more intricate, the governance of the colonies began to rely heavily on the standardization of commerce and the formalized instruction of the young. It was a period where the abstract concepts of value and literacy were subjected to rigorous systems of measurement and control. The quiet administration of the town meeting and the county court was now supplemented by the silent, pervasive authority of the ledger book and the schoolroom. Order was no longer just about boundaries and fences. It was about the accurate accounting of debt and the disciplined formation of the mind. The architecture of education was humble, yet its governance was precise. In many districts, the moving school was the prevailing system. The town did not always maintain a single, static building for instruction. Instead, the schoolmaster and his lessons were a mobile unit of governance, migrating between the various squadrons or districts of the township based on the tax revenue generated by each area. If the northern precinct paid a third of the taxes, the school would reside there for a third of the winter. This required a logistical coordination of space. A private room in a farmhouse, an abandoned corn crib, or a dedicated but rough-hewed structure would be secured. The arrival of the school was a calendar event, shifting the daily routine of every household in the vicinity. The hiring of the schoolmaster was a contractual obligation managed by the selectmen or a specific school committee. The contract was written with care, specifying not only the wages, often paid in grain or country pay rather than hard currency, but also the method of his accommodation. This was known as boarding round. The master was not a permanent resident of any one house, but was a guest of the community, moving from family to family on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. This system placed the agent of educational order directly into the domestic sphere. The master shared the hearth, the table, and often the bed of the families he served. His presence was a form of passive surveillance. He was an outsider observing the internal order of the households, even as he was dependent on them for his sustenance. Inside the schoolroom, the governance of the students was enforced through a rigid scarcity of materials. Paper was too expensive for casual use. The primary tool of instruction was the hornbook, a simple wooden paddle with a single sheet of paper tacked to it, covered by a translucent slice of cow's horn to protect the text. On this sheet was the alphabet, the vowels, a few syllables, and the Lord's Prayer. It was a static, durable interface. The children did not progress through stacks of books. They mastered this single object before moving to the primer. The primer itself was a small, bound book, its woodcut illustrations worn by the thumbs of countless predecessors. The pedagogy was one of rote memorization. The sound of the schoolhouse was a drone of unison recitation, a collective chanting of letters and syllables that ingrained the structure of language through sheer repetition. The heating of the school was another exercise in logistical governance. The firewood was not provided by the town in a single delivery, but was often supplied by the parents of the scholars as a form of tax or tuition. A load of wood bought a seat near the fire. The wood tax was measured in cords and feet. If a father failed to deliver his quota, his child might be relegated to the colder, darker corners of the room. The fire was the focal point of the physical space, and the management of the draft and the embers was a constant, smoky backdrop to the lessons. Parallel to the governance of education was the complex, silent governance of debt and currency. In an economy where gold and silver coins were rare, the entire structure of trade relied on a system of book debt. Every merchant, miller, and craftsman maintained a daybook and a ledger. These were not merely private records. They were the legal evidence of obligation. When a farmer purchased a pound of tea or a yard of linen, no money changed hands. Instead, the merchant opened his book and entered the transaction on the debit side. Weeks or months later, the farmer might return with bushels of rye or a firkin of butter, which would be entered on the credit side. This system required a meticulous reckoning. Periodically, the two parties would meet to compare their own records against the others. They would review the long columns of entries, verifying each item. Once they agreed on the balance, they would draw a line across the page, a physical act of crossing out the past, and sign their names to attest that the account was settled or that a new balance was carried forward. This was a governance of mutual trust and penmanship. A dispute over a scribbled figure or a forgotten entry could lead to the court, where the ledger itself would be presented as a witness. The physical condition of these books was vital. A page torn out or a line heavily blotted raised suspicion of fraud. The currency itself was a chaotic element that required constant calculation. There was a dizzying array of coins in circulation: Spanish pieces of 8, Portuguese joes, French guineas, and worn English shillings. Each had a different weight and fineness of metal. To govern this confusion, merchants and officials used coin scales, small handheld balances kept in wooden boxes. Every coin was weighed to detect clipping or sweating, practices where slivers of metal were shaved off the edges. A coin was not worth its face value, but its weight in grains of silver or gold. Tables of exchange were pinned to the walls of counting houses, listing the conversion rates which fluctuated based on the colony's statutes. Furthermore, the colonies issued their own paper money, known as bills of credit. These were indentured notes, printed on thick, coarse paper, often with complex patterns of leaves or scrolls to deter counterfeiting. However, the value of these bills often depreciated over time. A bill issued in 1740 might be worth significantly less in 1750. This introduced a temporal dimension to the governance of money. One had to know the tenor of the bill: old tenor, middle tenor, or new tenor. Contracts had to specify which currency was to be used. A debt recorded simply as pounds was meaningless without the qualifying adjective that defined the era of the money. This required a mental discipline from every citizen, a constant conversion calculation to navigate the daily economy. In the coastal ports, a different kind of order was imposed by the custom house. This was the physical manifestation of imperial trade laws. The custom house was usually located near the wharves, a building smelling of tar, old paper, and sea coal. Here, the governance of the ocean met the bureaucracy of the land. The collector of customs presided over a domain of manifests and certificates. Every ship that entered or cleared the harbor was required to submit to this paper regime. The captain had to present his manifest, a detailed list of every crate, barrel, and bale on board, along with the marks and numbers painted on them. The process of clearing out a ship for departure was a ritual of documentation. The captain had to swear an oath that his cargo contained no contraband and that he was bound for a permitted port. He received a cocket, a parchment scroll sealed with the royal arms, which served as his passport on the high seas. If he carried enumerated commodities, goods like tobacco or indigo that were restricted by the Navigation Acts, he had to post a bond, a heavy financial guarantee that he would deliver the goods only to an English port. The custom house clerk sat at high, slanted desks, copying these details into enormous folios. The tide waiters and land waiters were the enforcement officers who physically boarded the vessels, poking through the hold with iron rods to ensure that the cargo matched the paper. They sealed the hatches with lead seals at night to prevent smuggling. It was a system of surveillance that operated through the accumulation of ink and wax. Public health, too, had its own grim geography and set of protocols. The governance of disease was reactive but strictly spatial. The pest house was a designated structure, often located on a remote island or a secluded point of land, far from the town center. When smallpox or yellow fever arrived on a ship, the vessel was ordered to perform quarantine, a word derived from the Venetian 40 days of isolation. The ship would drop anchor in a specific ground, flying a yellow flag. The selectmen would issue orders forbidding anyone from approaching the vessel. Provisions were rowed out and left on the shore or hoisted up by rope. On land, if a house was infected, it became a microcosm of martial law. A fence might be erected around the property, or a red cloth hung from the window as a warning signal. The town would appoint guards to stand watch 24 hours a day, ensuring that no one entered or left the premises. These guards were paid from the town treasury, their wages recorded in the same books as the road menders. The nurse who attended the sick was often a person who had survived the disease and was thus immune. They were hired by the town to enter the zone of danger. The governance of the epidemic was a matter of containment, a physical blockade maintained until the distemper had burned itself out and the bedding had been burned or smoked with sulfur. The passage of time and the prediction of the future were governed by the almanac. This small, paper-covered booklet was the most common printed object in the household, often hanging by a loop of twine from the mantelpiece. It was a secular calendar that organized the agricultural and legal year. It contained the ephemeris, the tables of the sun's rising and setting, the phases of the moon, and the high tides. It listed the dates of the court sessions for every county, allowing men to plan their travel for litigation. It predicted the weather, expect snow here, windy and cool, which, however inaccurate, provided a psychological framework for the coming season. Included in the almanac was the Man of Signs, a woodcut diagram of a human body with the signs of the zodiac pointing to various parts, Aries to the head, Pisces to the feet. This was used to govern medical treatment and agricultural tasks. One did not bleed a patient when the moon was in the sign of the body part being treated. One did not castrate livestock or wean calves without consulting the astrological position. This was a governance of cosmic alignment, a belief that the biological world was linked to the celestial one, and that order could be maintained by adhering to these cycles. The almanac was often used as a diary. Blank pages were interleaved between the months where the head of the household would note the weather, the date of planting, and the death of neighbors. It became a personal history fused with universal time. The dissemination of news and law relied on the printing office. This was a workspace of mechanical rhythm and chemical smells. The printer was often the postmaster as well, placing him at the center of information flow. The press itself was a heavy wooden machine, a screw press that required physical strength to operate. The process was slow and repetitive. The compositor stood before the type cases, the uppercase for capitals and the lowercase for small letters, picking out individual lead letters one by one and placing them into a stick. It was a manual digitization of thought. Once the page was set, it was locked into a metal frame called a chase. The beater used 2 leather balls stuffed with wool and soaked in ink to beat the type, ensuring an even coating. The paper, dampened beforehand to take the impression better, was laid over the type. The puller yanked the great wooden handle, the bar, which turned the screw and pressed the platen down. The paper was removed and hung on cords to dry. This machine produced the broadsides, the proclamations, the sermons, and the newspapers that defined the public discourse. The government's laws did not exist effectively until they had passed through this mechanical process. The printer was a semi-official agent, paid by the colony to print the acts and resolves at the end of each legislative session. These stitched booklets were then distributed to the towns, the physical update to the operating system of the law. In the domestic sphere, the production of cloth was a regulated industry of the household. The governance of the flock and the flax field culminated in the spinning and weaving. While largely a female domain, it was integrated into the wider economy through the putting-out system. Merchants would distribute raw wool or flax to households, recording the weight in their ledgers. The women would card, spin, and sometimes weave the material, returning the finished yarn or cloth to the merchant. The payment was a credit in the store's book. This decentralized factory system was governed by the quality of the work. The count of the thread, its fineness and consistency, determined its value. A reel was used to measure the length of the yarn. It clicked after a certain number of rotations, creating a skein of standard length. This click was the audible metric of domestic production. Finally, the maintenance of the night watch in the larger towns introduced a nocturnal layer of governance. As the population grew, the reliance on a single constable was insufficient. The watch consisted of men drafted from the citizenry, serving on a rotation. They gathered at a watch house at sunset, carrying lanterns and staves. Their duty was to walk the rounds, crying the hour and the state of the weather. They checked for fire, the great terror of the wooden town. They stopped night walkers who could not give a good account of themselves. The watch was a performance of order in the darkness, a reassurance to the sleeping town that the eyes of the law were open. Their observations were recorded in a watch book, notes on lamps left burning, doors found unlocked, or noises heard from the wharves. These overlapping systems, the school's boarding round, the merchant's ledger, the custom house seal, the quarantine fence, the almanac's zodiac, and the printer's press, created a density of administration that permeated daily life. Order was not a singular edict from a king. It was a composite of thousands of small, recorded acts. It was found in the correct weight of a coin, the straight line of a ledger entry, and the verified manifest of a sloop. It was a world where nothing was truly forgotten, because everything, eventually, was written down. By the middle decades of the 18th century, the governance of the American settlements had evolved into a rigorous system of exclusion and admission, designed to protect the collective resources of the town from the burden of transients. This was the era of the warning out, a legal mechanism that defined the invisible walls of the community. It was a procedure rooted in the fear of the indigent stranger. When a new individual or family arrived in a town without an established freehold or a guarantee of employment, the clock began to tick on their residency. If they were allowed to remain for a specific period, often 12 months, without objection, they gained the legal status of an inhabitant, which entitled them to poor relief should they fall into poverty. To prevent this liability, the selectmen utilized the warning out warrant. This process was devoid of malice. It was a bureaucratic routine. The selectmen would issue a warrant to the constable, instructing him to visit the abode of the newcomer. The constable would read the order aloud, commanding the persons named to depart the limits of this town within a set number of days, usually 14. The names of the individuals, the date of their arrival, and the date of the warning were then meticulously recorded in the town records. This did not always mean the family was physically ejected. Often, they remained, living and working in the town for years. However, the legal act of the warning stripped them of the right to town support. It was a governance of liability, a paperwork shield that absolved the taxpayers of future costs. The Book of Warnings became a ledger of the precarious, listing those who lived within the geography of the town, but outside its safety net. Intersecting with this management of people was the strict governance of biological events, birth, marriage, and death. The town clerk acted as the registrar of vital statistics, a role that required a constant, morbid vigilance. The law demanded that parents report a birth within a certain number of days. The entry was brief: the name of the child, the names of the parents, and the date. There was no sentiment in the margin. Similarly, the publishment of the intention to marry was a mandatory public broadcast. A couple wishing to wed had to submit their names to the clerk, who would write a notice, "The banns," and post it in the designated box near the meeting house door or read it aloud at the end of the Sabbath service for 3 consecutive weeks. This crying of the banns was a governance of transparency, allowing any member of the community to raise a lawful objection, a prior contract, a consanguinity, or an apprenticeship not yet served. If no objection was lodged, the clerk issued a certificate, a slip of paper that authorized the minister or the justice of the peace to perform the ceremony. The wedding itself was often a simple domestic event, but the recording of it was a permanent civic act. The death record was the final entry, closing the account. In times of epidemic, the clerk's handwriting often deteriorated under the volume of entries, yet the duty to record remained absolute. These 3 lists, births, marriages, deaths, formed the demographic skeleton of the society, preserved in leather-bound volumes that grew heavy with the weight of generations. As the economy diversified, the governance of the mill became a central feature of daily life. The grist mill was not private property in the modern sense. It was a public utility regulated by statute. The miller held a monopoly on the water power of the stream, and in exchange, his rates were fixed by law. He was not paid in currency, but in kind. This was known as the miller's toll. The law specified exactly how much grain he could deduct from every bushel he ground, often 1/16 of the whole. To ensure fairness, the toll dish itself was a regulated measure. It was a wooden scoop or box, sealed and stamped by the town sealer, ensuring it held the precise legal fraction. The operation of the mill was a rhythm of heavy mechanics. The farmer would bring his sacks of corn or rye, waiting his turn in the yard. The rule of the mill was strictly first come, first served. Inside, the air was thick with flour dust, which coated the cobwebs in the rafters white. The governance of the stone was a technical art. The miller had to dress the millstones regularly. This involved lifting the heavy runner stone with a crane and using a steel pick to recut the grooves, the furrows and lands that sheared the grain. A dull stone would crush and burn the meal rather than grinding it cool. The sound of the pick striking the hard grit of the stone was a sharp, repetitive clicking that could be heard for hours. The texture of the meal was inspected by the customer. If it was too coarse, the miller was liable. The mill was a place of transformation, where the raw harvest was converted into sustenance, under the watchful eye of weights and measures. Further into the interior, or in regions rich with bog iron, the ironworks introduced an industrial governance to the landscape. The blast furnace was a beast that required a vast, organized logistical tale. It consumed charcoal, not wood. This necessitated the governance of the forest by the colliers. These men lived in the woods for months, building conical mounds of timber, covering them with earth and sod, and burning them slowly to create charcoal. The process required 24-hour vigilance to ensure the wood carbonized but did not burn to ash. The charcoal basket was the unit of measure, and the load delivered to the furnace was tallied by the clerk of the ironworks. The furnace itself was a structure of stone 30 feet high, which ran continuously for months, a blast. The founder was the master of this machine, regulating the bellows and the mix of ore, flux limestone, and charcoal. The governance here was one of heat and chemistry. The liquid iron was tapped from the hearth and ran into a main trench in the sand floor, feeding smaller side trenches, the sow and the pigs. The resulting pig iron was stamped with the mark of the forge. The clerk of the works managed the company store, as the workers were often paid in goods rather than coin. His ledger was complex, tracking the output of iron against the intake of thousands of cords of wood, creating a balance sheet of industrial extraction. In the dense wooden towns, the fear of fire birthed a specialized form of private governance, the fire society. These were voluntary associations of prominent citizens who banded together for mutual protection. Each member was required by the society's articles to own specific equipment: 2 heavy leather buckets, a bed key for dismantling bed frames quickly, and a large canvas bag for salvaging valuables. These items were inspected quarterly by the society's clerk. If a member's buckets were found dry or cracking, or if the owner's name was not painted clearly on them, he was fined. When the cry of fire was raised, often by the ringing of the church bell in a rapid, discordant peal, the society members were bound by oath to rush to the scene. This was not a chaotic mob, but a structured response. The fire wards were officers authorized to command the bucket lines. They carried a staff of office, often painted red, and had the legal authority to order the demolition of buildings to create a fire break. The society members would use their canvas bags to rescue the possessions of the victim, standing guard over the pile of saved goods to prevent looting. After the fire, the buckets were collected. The sorting of the buckets was a post-calamity ritual where the leather vessels were returned to their owners based on the painted names. This system relied on the preparedness of the individual to secure the safety of the whole. The transmission of property through land deeds was another layer of textual order. The Registry of Deeds was a county office, separate from the courts. Here, the conveyance of land was made permanent. A deed was a narrative description of a plot, written on parchment. It relied on metes and bounds, a system of describing the perimeter. Beginning at the pile of stones on the widow's corner, thence northerly 40 rods to the great pine, thence easterly along the brook. The registrar copied these deeds into massive folios. To ensure the authenticity of the transfer, the seller had to acknowledge the deed before a justice of the peace, who would sign the back. The governance of the land required that these books be indexed. The grantor index and the grantee index allowed a clerk to trace the chain of title back to the original royal grant. This was the archive of ownership, a paper guarantee that the land under one's feet truly belonged to them. Traveling across this landscape was governed by the rudimentary system of the stage wagon and later the stagecoach. This was not a casual endeavor. The stage lines operated on a published schedule, the advertisement, which promised departure at a specific hour, God willing. The driver or whip carried a waybill. This was a document listing the passengers, their destination, and the fare paid. It was the manifest of the journey. The stagecoach was a moving jurisdiction. The driver had authority over the seating and the conduct of the passengers. The staging inns, where the horses were changed, were nodes in this network. The ostler's stablemen had to have fresh teams harnessed and ready. The speed of travel was dictated by the condition of the road and the stamina of the animals, governed by the driver's judgment. The arrival of the stage was a synchronization point for the village, bringing mail, newspapers, and the physical reality of the outside world. Medicine, too, was a trade governed by the ledger and the saddlebag. The country doctor did not work in a clinic, he rode a circuit. His governance was the day book. In this, he recorded his visits and his prescriptions in Latin abbreviations. RX for recipe take, pulv for powder, gut for drops. He was often his own apothecary, compounding medicines in his study using a mortar and pestle. The scales of the physician were delicate. using the apothecary's system of weights, grains, scruples, drams, and ounces. He carried his pharmacy with him in the saddlebags, vials of calomel, jalap, opium, and bark. The relationship between doctor and patient was also an economic one, recorded in the book. Payment was slow and often in kind. The doctor's ledger might show a credit of one side of pork or shoeing of the horse against a debit for attendance in childbed or setting of the bone. The apprenticeship was the governance of medical education. A young man would bond himself to an established doctor for several years, paying a fee to read medicine in the doctor's library and ride with him on his rounds. There were no exams, only the certificate of the master attesting that the student was qualified to practice. This was a lineage of knowledge passed down through observation and the copying of formulas into a personal notebook. The concept of the peace was physically maintained by the hue and cry. This was an ancient common law process that remained active in the colonies. If a felony was committed, a horse stolen, or a prisoner escaped, the local magistrate would issue a warrant for a hue and cry. This required all able-bodied men to join in the pursuit of the suspect. The warrant traveled from town to town. When the constable of one town received it, he was obliged to raise the cry in his jurisdiction, search his precinct, and then pass the warrant to the constable of the next town. It was a relay race of law enforcement. The document itself grew as it traveled, with each constable endorsing the back to prove he had done his duty. This system turned the entire countryside into a dragnet, governed by the speed of the horse and the obligation of the citizen to assist the law. In the coastal towns, the rope walk was a specialized industrial corridor. It was a long, low building, sometimes 1,000 feet in length, where hemp was twisted into cordage for ships. The governance of the rope was a matter of geometry and tension. The spinner walked backward, wrapping the hemp fibers around his waist, feeding them into the wheel that twisted the yarn. The layer followed, twisting the yarns into strands and the strands into rope. The quality of the rope determined the safety of the ship. The master rope maker inspected the hemp for rot and the finished line for consistency. The sale of the rope was by weight, calculated in hundredweights CWT. The smell of hot tar, used to preserve the standing rigging, permeated the district. This was a manufacture of linear strength, measured in fathoms. The public vendue, or auction, was a mechanism for the liquidation of goods, often used by the courts or for the sale of impounded livestock. The auctioneer was a licensed official. He stood on a block or a crate, holding a hammer or a gavel. The governance of the vendue was the conditions of sale, read aloud before the bidding began. These conditions specified the terms of payment, cash on the nail or credit with approved security. The rhythmic chant of the auctioneer was a ritual of valuation, determining the market price of a cow, a hay wagon, or a confiscated estate through the public competition of voices. The clerk of the sale recorded the final prices, creating an incontestable record of the transfer. Even the ringing of the swine was a matter of specific seasonal governance. In the autumn, the pannage, or mast, season allowed pigs to forage in the woods for acorns and nuts. However, to prevent them from becoming feral or damaging the roots of trees, the town bylaws often required them to be ringed in the nose. The inspection of the rings was a task for the hog reeve. A pig found without a ring was liable to be impounded. This small piece of wire was a tool of environmental management, balancing the need to fatten the livestock with the need to preserve the forest floor. The perambulation of the bounds was a ritual performed once every few years by the selectmen of adjacent towns. They would meet at a specific corner marker, a heap of stones or a marked tree, and walk the entire length of the boundary line that separated their jurisdictions. They carried the original charter descriptions. As they walked, they renewed the marks, clearing brush and piling fresh stones. This was a physical reaffirmation of the political geography. It was often a social occasion, ending with a shared meal at a tavern, but its purpose was legal. If the bounds were not perambulated and recorded, the lines could be challenged. The memory of the line was maintained by the movement of the men along it. Within the home, the keeping of the fire was a domestic governance of energy. Matches did not exist. If the fire went out, it had to be rekindled with flint and steel, a difficult task, or by carrying live coals from a neighbor's house in a fire pan or an iron pot. Therefore, the governance of the hearth was a nightly routine of banking the fire. The ashes were carefully raked over the glowing embers to starve them of oxygen, just enough to keep them smoldering until morning. The curfew, from the French couvre-feu, cover fire, was originally a regulation to prevent conflagrations, signaled by the evening bell. It was a command to dampen the domestic industry and prepare for the governance of sleep. These systems, the warning out, the toll dish, the fire bucket, the daybook, the hue and cry, and the perambulation, formed a dense interlocking mesh of routines. There was a correct way to measure corn, a correct way to record a marriage, and a correct way to extinguish a fire. It was a society that found comfort in the true and perfect inventory of its own existence. The quiet bureaucratic violence of the warning out warrant coexisted with the communal safety of the fire society. The world was unpredictable, filled with disease, storms, and crop failures. But the response to it was a slow, stubborn imposition of human order, written in ink and enforced by the weight of custom. By the latter half of the 18th century, the web of governance had tightened around the specific trades and commodities that sustained the colonial economy. As the settlements matured, the need to guarantee the quality of manufactured goods became a matter of public administration. The reputation of a town's export was a collective asset, protected by a cadre of specialized officers who operated with stamps, brands, and seals. One of the most rigorously governed industries was the production of leather. The sealer of leather was a sworn official, distinct from the tanner or the shoemaker, whose duty was to ensure that the chemical transformation of the hide had been completed according to the statute. The governance of the tannery was a matter of time and chemistry. The law often stipulated how long a hide must remain in the vats of lime and oak bark liquor. It was an offensive trade, relegated to the outskirts of the village near running water, yet it was vital. The sealer would visit the tan yards to inspect the leather before it could be sold. He carried a metal hammer with a die cut into its face. If the leather was found to be well tanned, curried, and dried, he would strike the hide, leaving a permanent impression, the seal of the town. This mark was the license for the leather to enter the market. If a tanner attempted to sell a hide that was green or prone to rot, the sealer had the authority to seize the goods and impose a fine, a portion of which often went to the informer who reported the breach. Parallel to this was the assize of bread, a regulatory system inherited from medieval custom but applied with strict mathematical precision in the colonies. The price of a loaf of bread was not fixed, but its weight was. The town authorities published a table of the assize based on the fluctuating price of a bushel of wheat. If wheat was expensive, the penny loaf became smaller. If wheat was cheap, the loaf grew larger. The baker was required to mark every loaf with his initials before it went into the oven. The clerk of the market, or a bread weigher, would circulate through the town, entering the bakeries unannounced with a set of scales. He would weigh the bread against the current standard. A loaf found to be light was confiscated and often distributed to the poor, while the baker paid a penalty. This system ensured that the fluctuating cost of grain was transmitted transparently to the consumer, governed by a public calculation. The market house itself, usually an open-sided structure with a roof supported by brick or stone pillars, was the theater of commercial governance. Trade here was not a free-for-all but a scheduled ritual. The clerk of the market controlled the bell. Before the bell rang, usually in the early morning, no buying or selling was permitted. This prevented forestalling, the practice of buying up goods before they reached the open market to manipulate prices. Once the bell tolled, the stalls opened. The clerk patrolled the aisles, testing the butter for weight and the meat for wholesomeness. He carried a set of standard measures, the quart, the peck, and the bushel, to verify the containers used by the farmers. The governance of the market was a sensory task, smelling the fish, feeling the firmness of the butter, and listening to the ring of the coin. In towns situated along the wide tidal rivers, the ferry was a critical node of infrastructure, governed as a monopoly franchise. The ferryman was licensed by the Court of General Sessions. His rates were not arbitrary, they were set by the court and had to be posted clearly on a board at the landing. For a man and horse, 2 pence. For a wheel carriage, 6 pence. For a sheep or swine, 1/2 penny. The governance of the ferry involved the maintenance of the boat, which had to be substantial and equipped with oars and setting poles. In some places, a heavy rope or chain was strung across the river, the boat pulled along it by the ferryman's gloved hands. The license often stipulated the hours of operation, requiring the ferryman to be available from sunrise to a certain hour after dark. His absence was a punishable neglect of public duty. The storage of the community's munitions introduced the powder house to the landscape. Unlike the militia training which involved men, this was the governance of volatile material. The town stock of gunpowder was kept in a small, windowless structure, often built of brick or stone with a lightweight roof designed to blow upward in case of an explosion, sparing the walls. The keeper of the powder house was responsible for the inventory. His duties were dangerous and quiet. He had to enter the magazine wearing shoes without iron nails to prevent sparks. Periodically, he had to turn the barrels of powder to prevent the saltpeter from separating and settling, which would render the powder useless. He also inspected the flints and the lead musket balls. This was a silent governance of readiness, a stockpile waiting in the dark for an emergency. For those who fell into debt, the governance of the prison offered a strange compromise known as the liberty of the yard. The debtor was not always confined to a cell. If he could provide a bond, a financial guarantee from a friend, he was allowed to walk outside the prison walls within a specific, defined perimeter. These were the jail liberties. The boundaries were often marked by specific houses, trees, or posts in the town center. The debtor could work and visit shops within this invisible box but could not step beyond it. It was a psychological confinement governed by a map. If he crossed the line, even for a moment, the bond was forfeited and the creditor could demand the full debt from the bondsman. This system turned a portion of the town into an open-air prison, where the restraint was legal rather than physical. The salt marshes along the coast were a communal resource governed by the tides and the calendar. The cutting of the salt hay was a coordinated effort. Since the marshes were often too soft to support wagons during the harvest, the hay was stacked on staddles. clusters of wooden posts driven into the marsh mud to create a platform above the high tide mark. The hay wards oversaw the allocation of these lots. The hay would be left on the staddles to cure and was retrieved only when the ground froze hard in the winter, allowing sleds to be driven out onto the ice. This deferred harvest was a governance of the seasons, a logistical delay imposed by the nature of the terrain. Export trade required the packer of provisions. As barrels of beef and pork were prepared for the long sea voyages to the West Indies or Europe, the packer ensured the meat was preserved correctly. He supervised the salting process, ensuring that a sufficient quantity of salt was used and that the brine was of the correct strength. He checked that the pieces of meat were packed tightly to exclude air. Once satisfied, he branded the head of the barrel with the quality, mess beef, or prime pork, and his official mark. This brand was the guarantee of the colony's honor. A barrel that spoiled at sea was a blemish on the port's reputation, so the packer's governance was one of strict conservatism, favoring heavy salting and solid cooperage. The town crier served as the audible bulletin of the governance system. In an era of limited literacy and slow printing, the spoken announcement was the fastest method of dissemination. The crier was an officer who walked the streets, ringing a handbell to gather attention. He would stop at designated corners to cry the news: a lost child, a stray horse, an auction, or a town meeting. His voice was a regulated instrument. He was paid a fee for each announcement, often set by the length of the message. The cry began with the standard "Oyez, oyez, hear ye," a linguistic relic of Norman law. He was the human broadcast system, amplifying the written notices of the clerk to the illiterate public. The sealer of weights and measures maintained the integrity of the physical tools of commerce. His kit included a set of standard brass weights, a graduated beam, and a branding iron. Once a year, he visited every shop, mill, and tavern. He would test the steelyards, portable balances, and the wooden measures used for grain or rum. If a measure was accurate, he stamped it with the year and the town's initial. If it was faulty, he had the authority to destroy it or seize it for correction. The uncorrected beam was an abomination to the order of the town. This governance ensured that a pound of sugar bought in one shop was physically identical to a pound bought in another. The viewer of lumber was the gatekeeper of the timber trade. At the landing places where logs were floated downriver, this officer measured the board feet of the lumber. He carried a scale rule, a specialized ruler calibrated to calculate volume based on the length and diameter of the log. He also graded the wood, distinguishing between clear boards and those with knots or wane, bark edges. He marked the lumber with a scribing knife or red chalk. His tally sheet determined the payment the logger received from the merchant. It was a governance of geometry applied to the irregular shapes of the forest. In the realm of animal husbandry, the mark of the creature was a registered form of property governance. Every livestock owner had a unique ear mark, a specific combination of cuts, crops, slits, and notches made in the ear of the animal. These marks were drawn and described in the town clerk's book. A crop off the right ear and a slit in the left. When a stray animal was found, the finder would describe the ear mark to the clerk or the hayward, who would consult the registry to identify the owner. This was a visual language of ownership, a permanent governance carved into the flesh of the herd. The gauger of casks was the specialist in liquid volume. Barrels made by hand varied slightly in size. The gauger used a gauging rod, a long stick with a sliding caliper, to measure the internal dimensions of a cask, the head diameter, the bung diameter, and the length. Using a complex set of mathematical tables or a slide rule, he calculated the precise capacity in gallons. He then scribed the volume on the wood near the bung hole. This prevented disputes between the distiller and the merchant. The gauger's mark was the definitive answer to the question of how much rum or molasses a barrel contained. The color of bricks ensured the durability of construction. Bricks were fired in local kilns, and the quality varied depending on their position in the fire. The place bricks from the outside of the stack were soft and under-fired, suitable only for interior walls. The arch bricks were hard and durable. The color inspected the loads delivered to a building site, rejecting those that were too soft to withstand the weather. He struck the bricks together. A good brick rang with a metallic sound, while a bad one gave a dull thud. This acoustic governance protected the town from crumbling chimneys and dissolving foundations. Even the collection of rags for paper making was a regulated activity. As the demand for paper grew, the raw material, linen and cotton rags, became scarce. Ragmen were licensed to travel the countryside, exchanging small items like pins, needles, or crockery for bags of old cloth. The governance here was economic encouragement. The legislatures often passed acts exempting rag collectors from certain taxes or duties to ensure the supply for the paper mills. The saving of rags was preached as a civic duty, a domestic governance of waste that fed the machinery of the press. The informers were the shadow agents of these systems. Many statutes included a qui tam provision, where the penalty for a violation was divided, half to the poor of the town and half to the person who informed and prosecuted the offender. This incentivized citizens to watch their neighbors for breaches of the law, selling liquor without a license, poaching deer out of season, or failing to ring swine. The governance of the town thus relied on a network of private observation, fueled by the prospect of a share in the fine. It was a self-policing mechanism that turned silence into a commodity. Finally, the funeral was a highly structured event governed by the sumptuary laws and custom. The giving of funeral gloves and rings to the mourners was a practice that had to be managed to prevent the ruin of the estate. The quality of the gloves, white kidskin or chamois, denoted the rank of the deceased and the recipient. The coffin maker was a carpenter who built the box to measure, often lining it with flannel. The sexton was paid to dig the grave and toll the bell. The cost of the funeral baked meats and the drink provided to the mourners was a line item in the probate account, scrutinized by the judge to ensure it was reasonable and proportionate to the estate's value. The final act of a life was its orderly removal from the rolls of the living, a process managed by the exchange of standardized tokens and the payment of regulated fees. By the late 18th century, the machinery of governance had developed a distinct corporate layer known as the proprietors of the common and undivided lands. In many settlements, the political entity of the town and the landowning entity of the proprietors were separate bodies, each with its own records and officers. The proprietors were the original shareholders of the land grant, and their governance was focused on the methodical conversion of wilderness into private property. They met not to pass laws for behavior, but to manage the division. The proprietor's clerk kept a specific book, often known as the Book of Locations or the proprietor's records. This volume detailed the mathematical partition of the earth. The process of land distribution was governed by the drawing of lots. This was a literal lottery designed to ensure fairness in the allocation of unequal terrain. The land to be divided, whether a tract of meadow, A stand of cedar swamp or a range of rocky hills was surveyed and sliced into numbered parcels. The names of the proprietors were written on slips of paper and the lot numbers on others. These were drawn from a hat or a box in a public ceremony. The result was a pitch. A man might draw lot number 4 in the 3rd division, a specific rectangle of geography that now belonged to him in fee simple. The governance here was one of chance supervised by the strict observation of peers, ensuring that the best soil was not monopolized by the powerful. The clerk recorded the result. Drawn to Hezekiah Smith, the 2nd lot in the Great Plain. Parallel to the management of land was the extermination of predators, a system governed by the Bounty Acts. The wolf, the bear, and the panther were not merely physical threats, but were legally defined as enemies of the public wealth. The legislature set a specific price on their heads. The bounty was a financial transaction managed by the town treasurer. To claim the reward, a man had to bring the physical proof, usually the head or the ears, to the constable or selectman. The officer was required by law to deface the trophy, often by cutting off the ears in the presence of the claimant, to prevent the same head from being presented in a neighboring town for a second payment. This system extended to smaller pests. The Crow Act or similar statutes required every householder to produce a certain quota of heads of crows, blackbirds, or squirrels annually. This was a tax payable in death. The failure to present the required number of heads resulted in a monetary fine added to the town rate. The town clerk kept a tally of these grim payments. It was a governance of ecology, an attempt to cleanse the agricultural landscape through a bureaucratic incentive structure. In the bustling coastal ports, the governance of the harbor required the authority of the wharfinger and the harbor master. The water itself was a regulated zone. One of the most critical laws concerned ballast. Ships arriving light without cargo carried tons of stone or gravel in their holds to maintain stability. The dumping of this ballast was strictly controlled to prevent the harbor from silting up. The harbor master designated specific ballast grounds, or required the stone to be unloaded onto a wharf for use in road building. To throw ballast overboard into the channel was a high crime against the commerce of the port. The wharfinger managed the traffic at the dockside, assigning berths and collecting wharfage, the fee for tying up and for the goods that crossed the timber deck. He measured the time a ship stayed. A vessel that lingered too long after unloading was ordered to haul off to the anchorage to make room for the next. The rising industrial ambition of the colonies led to the inspection of pot and pearl ashes. Potash, made from the leached ashes of burned hardwood, was a vital chemical export used in the manufacture of glass and soap in Europe. Its value depended entirely on its purity. The inspector of potash was a colonial officer equipped with a chemical kit. He would visit the warehouses where the heavy barrels of ash were stored. He used a crusher to break open the solid mass and tested it for adulteration, stone, lime, or salt added to increase weight. He classified the product, first sort, second sort, or condemned. He then branded the barrel with the quality and his name. This brand was the certificate that allowed the barrel to be loaded onto a ship. It was a governance of industrial chemistry, ensuring that the forest's residue was converted into a standardized commodity. In the town centers, the public scale, or hay scale, became a fixture of economic order. This was a large, heavy mechanism, often a platform scale housed under a roof, capable of weighing a fully loaded wagon and team of oxen. The weigher of hay was the sworn officer who operated it. Farmers bringing hay to market were required to drive onto the platform. The weigher manipulated the massive iron counterweights on the beam until it balanced. He would then subtract the tare, the known weight of the wagon, to determine the net weight of the hay. He issued a ticket, a slip of paper stating the weight, which the farmer handed to the buyer. This prevented the guessing of loads, a practice that led to endless disputes. The fee for weighing was split between the officer and the town treasury. The clanking of the great beam was the sound of a fair transaction. The heating of the town was governed by the measurer of wood. As firewood was the sole source of heat, its sale was critical. The unit of trade was the cord, a stack measuring 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and 8 feet long. However, wood could be stacked loosely to cheat the buyer. The measurer's duty was to inspect the wood as it lay on the sled or was piled in the yard. He carried a measuring stick and a keen eye for air holes. He had the authority to repack a pile to see if it truly met the dimensions. If the wood was crooked or rotten, he reduced the allowance. He issued a certificate of quantity. The transaction between the woodcutter and the householder was not valid without this official measurement. It was a governance of volume, ensuring that the winter fuel was a known quantity. To finance large public works, a bridge over a wide river, a new town hall, or a college building, the government often turned to the lottery. This was not a private gambling operation, but a state-sanctioned fiscal instrument. The legislature would pass an act authorizing a lottery for a specific purpose. Managers were appointed to oversee the scheme. They were responsible for printing the tickets, which were elaborate engravings signed by hand to prevent forgery. The governance of the lottery involved the drawing, a public event often held in the town house. 2 wheels were used, one containing the ticket numbers and the other the prizes or blanks. Boys, often from the local orphanage or school, were employed to pull the tickets from the wheels. The managers recorded the winners in a ledger and published the results in the newspapers. It was a method of taxation by consent, governed by the laws of probability and strict accounting. The movement of goods by itinerant traders was restricted by the law of hawkers and peddlers. The established shopkeepers, who paid taxes on their stores, viewed the traveling peddler as a threat. Consequently, the government required these men to hold a license. The license was expensive and had to be renewed annually at the Court of Sessions. The peddler was required to have his name and license number painted on his pack or his cart. He was forbidden from selling certain goods, often indigo or feathers, which were reserved for settled merchants. The constable had the right to stop any peddler on the road and demand to see his license. If he could not produce it, his goods could be seized. This was a governance of the market, protecting the static merchant from the mobile competitor. The legal mechanism for recovering wrongful seizures was the writ of replevin. If a man's cattle were impounded by the field driver or his goods taken by the sheriff, and he believed the action was illegal, he could seek a writ of replevin. This was a command from the court to the officer to return the goods to the owner pending a trial. It was a complex piece of governance that allowed the citizen to challenge the immediate enforcement of the law. The owner had to post a bond for twice the value of the goods. This initiated a legal chess match where the property, the cow or the table, was returned to the owner, but the liability remained until the court decided the case. It was a check on the power of the executive officers, a procedural loop that balanced authority with property rights. The end of an apprenticeship was governed by the custom and contract of freedom dues. When a young man completed his 7 years of service, the master was legally obligated to provide him with the means to start his life as a free citizen. The indenture contract typically specified these dues: 2 suits of apparel, one for the Lord's day and one for working days. Sometimes it included a set of tools for his trade or a specific sum of money. The governance of this transition was critical. If a master failed to provide the dues, the apprentice could sue in the court of common pleas. The freedom suit was the physical manifestation of the apprentice's new status. He walked out of the master's house wearing the clothes that signified his independence, a graduation governed by the thread count of the coat and the quality of the buttons. The surveyor of hemp and flax was an officer appointed to encourage and regulate the production of textile fibers. The colonies were desperate to reduce their dependence on imported cloth. The government offered bounties for high-quality hemp. The surveyor's job was to inspect the bundles of fiber. He checked for rots and shives, pieces of the woody stalk. He determined if the hemp was water-rotted or dew-rotted, processes that affected the strength of the fiber. Only hemp that passed his inspection was eligible for the bounty or for use in the naval cordage. This was a governance of agriculture directed toward strategic independence. In the realm of finance, the land bank was an experiment in governance where currency was backed by real estate rather than silver. Subscribers mortgaged their lands to the bank and received manufactory bills in return. The governance of this system required the appraisers of estates to value the mortgaged properties. The books of the land bank were a registry of the colony's land wealth converted into paper circulation. It was a controversial system, often suppressed by imperial authorities, but for a time, it represented a governance of credit that bypassed the scarcity of hard coin. The viewer of staves and hoops governed the packaging industry. Barrels were the shipping containers of the era. The stave's sides and hoops' bindings had to be perfect. A barrel that burst in the hold of a ship caused the loss of valuable cargo. The viewer inspected the bundles of staves on the wharf. He used a culling ring or a gauge to check the dimensions. He looked for worm holes and sap wood. He counted the staves by the 100, which, by the long 100 count of the trade, was actually 120 staves. This specific commercial arithmetic was part of the governance of the trade, a custom codified into law to prevent misunderstandings between the cooper and the merchant. The sealer of weights also had jurisdiction over the charcoal basket. Since charcoal was sold by volume, the size of the basket was a matter of public concern. The standard basket was 2 bushels. The sealer would measure the basket's dimensions and brand the rim. The collier, charcoal burner, could not sell his product in an unbranded basket. This prevented the subtle shrinking of the container, a form of inflation that the governance system sought to block through physical standardization. The clerk of the writs was a lesser-known official, often a distinct role in the early years, empowered to issue the initial summons or attachment that began a lawsuit. He was the entry point to the legal system. In towns far from the county seat, the clerk of the writs provided the necessary forms, the capias, arrest warrant, or the summons, allowing the machinery of justice to be activated locally. He charged a small fee, fixed by statute, for every writ he filled out. His handwriting triggered the sheriff's ride. Finally, the keeper of the light, or the lighthouse keeper, was a solitary agent of governance on the edge of the ocean. His duty was simple but absolute. The light must burn. The governance of the lighthouse involved the logistical supply of whale oil, wicks, and glass. The keeper was required to keep a logbook of the weather, the oil consumed, and the ship sighted. He was paid a salary by the colony or the province, funded by light money, a tax levied on the tonnage of every vessel entering the harbor. The beam of light cutting through the darkness was a government service. a navigational aid paid for by the collective shipping industry and maintained by the nightly labor of one man trimming a wick. These disparate roles, the drawing of the lot, the cutting of the wolf's ear, the weighing of the hay, the branding of the potash, and the lighting of the lamp, were all expressions of a single desire, to create a predictable world. The proprietors tamed the map, the weigher tamed the market, and the inspector tamed the product. It was a governance that believed that if everything could be measured, counted, and recorded, the chaos of existence could be held at bay. Toward the closing years of the 18th century, the governance of the landscape underwent a subtle but profound shift. The maintenance of order began to move from the collective obligation of the town to the managed precision of the corporation. This was the era of the turnpike, a system that imposed a new layer of financial geometry upon the old, meandering paths of the colonists. The road was no longer merely a cleared track maintained by the seasonal labor of farmers. It became a commercial entity, a strip of land governed by a charter and a gate. The Turnpike Corporation was created by an act of the legislature, a document that granted a group of investors the right to build a road in a straight line, cutting through fences, woodlots, and hills. The governance of this road was centered on the toll house. This was a small, narrow dwelling, often built directly onto the shoulder of the highway, extending a roof or a portico over the travel lane. The gatekeeper lived here, a man or woman whose entire life was regulated by the sound of approaching hooves. The gate itself was a heavy beam, sometimes tipped with iron spikes, a pike, that swung across the road, physically barring passage until the law of the toll was satisfied. The table of rates was the constitution of this small domain. It was painted on a large wooden board using weather-resistant lead paint and affixed to the front of the house where it could be read by the traveler. The tariff was specific and complex, a categorization of all moving things. For every sulky, chair, or chaise, 10 cents. For every coach, phaeton, or chariot, 20 cents. For every cart drawn by one beast, 6 cents. For every horse and rider, 4 cents. For every score of sheep or swine, 3 cents. The governance of the road required the gatekeeper to instantly classify the traffic, counting the wheels and the animals. There were exemptions, strictly defined by statute. Persons going to or from public worship, or to a grist mill, or on military duty were permitted to pass free. These exceptions required the keeper to interrogate the traveler, verifying their destination and intent. To enforce this system, the law created the offense of shunpiking. This was the act of leaving the road before the gate, traversing a neighbor's field or a side track, and rejoining the turnpike beyond the barrier to evade the toll. The governance of the turnpike thus extended into the surrounding terrain. The corporation had the legal standing to prosecute shunpickers, and the courts heard cases involving the geometry of wheel tracks in the mud, evidence used to prove the circumvention of the gate. The road itself was constructed with a new attention to engineering. The corduroy method involved laying logs perpendicular to the direction of travel in swampy areas, while the macadam method, introduced later, relied on layers of broken stone, sized to pass through a specific iron ring. The surveyor of the turnpike checked the camber of the road, ensuring it arched in the center to shed water into the side ditches, a physical design that enforced the longevity of the investment. In the rapidly growing urban centers, the governance of poverty transitioned from the binding-out system to the institutional architecture of the workhouse or bridewell. This was a building designed for the reformation of the idle. The governance of the workhouse was detailed in a set of printed rules and orders hung in the entryway. The inmates were classified not by crime, but by their capacity for labor. The overseer of the workhouse was the governor of this micro-society. He kept a register of admissions, recording the name, age, and physical condition of every entrant. The internal economy of the house was based on the task. Men were often assigned to picking oakum, unraveling old, tarred ropes from ships to create loose fiber for caulking. The daily quota was measured by weight. A man had to produce a certain number of pounds of oakum to receive his full ration of food. Women were employed in the spinning room, their output of yarn measured by the skein. The governance of the diet was strict and repetitive. The bill of fare specified the meals for each day of the week. Monday, mush and molasses. Tuesday, beef and broth. Wednesday, peas porridge. The food was weighed and distributed in measured portions. The cell of solitary was the disciplinary corrective for those who refused the task or broke the silence of the workroom. It was a governance of the body through the regulation of calories and exertion. Parallel to the roads, the construction of the canal introduced a governance of water that was entirely artificial. The canal was a flat highway of water, independent of the river's current. The lock was the machine that allowed this defiance of gravity. The lock tender was the officer of this system. He lived in a house beside the stone chamber of the lock. His duty was to manage the wickets, the valves that allowed water to fill or drain the chamber. The passage of a boat was a coordinated hydraulic event. The boat entered. The massive wooden gates were closed using heavy balance beams, and the water level was manipulated. The governance of the canal relied on the weigh lock. To determine the toll, which was based on the tonnage of the cargo, the boat was floated into a specialized chamber. The water was drained, leaving the boat resting on a cradle suspended from a massive overhead scale. The weigh master adjusted the weights to determine the precise mass of the vessel and its load. The toll was calculated in mils per ton per mile. The waybill, or clearance paper, was the passport of the canal, listing the cargo, barrels of flour, crates of glass, tons of coal, and the distance to be traveled. The speed of the canal boat was also governed. To prevent the wake from eroding the earthen banks, the horses drawing the boat were restricted to a walk. No boat to exceed 4 miles per hour was a rule enforced by the vigilant eyes of the pathmasters. In the realm of higher education, the college functioned as a semi-autonomous jurisdiction with its own code of law. The laws of the college were read aloud to the students upon their matriculation. The governance of the student body was hierarchical, often involving a system of fagging or servitude where freshmen were obligated to perform errands for seniors. The tutor, or proctor, lived in the dormitory, acting as the resident magistrate. He had the authority to visit rooms during study hours to ensure that students were at their desks. The quarter bill was the ledger of the student's fiscal and moral standing. It listed the charges for tuition, commons, meals, and study rent. Crucially, it also listed the fines. The governance of behavior was monetized. There was a specific fine for tardiness at prayers, absence from recitation, playing at cards, or breaking a window. The glazier was a frequent visitor to the college yard, and the cost of replacing glass was divided among the students of the district if the culprit could not be identified. The buttery was the college store, managed by the butler, who kept a book of debts for the cider, biscuits, and candles sold to the scholars. The monitor was a student appointed to mark the attendance roll at the chapel, a peer conducting the surveillance of the flock. As the printed word proliferated, the subscription library emerged as a governance of shared knowledge. Books were expensive and often imported. A group of citizens would form a library company, signing articles of association. To join, one purchased a share, which granted the right to borrow books. The librarian was the custodian of this property. The governance of the book itself was physical. The volumes were often covered in heavy paper or leather to protect the binding. A label was pasted inside the front cover, detailing the rules of the library. These rules govern the time of possession. A folio may be kept 4 weeks, a quarto 3 weeks, an octavo 2 weeks. The fine for detaining a book beyond the limit was calculated in pence per day. There were specific fines for damage. For turning down a leaf, 2 pence. For a grease spot, 6 pence. For a tear, the value of the book. The librarian inspected each returned volume, turning the pages to check for these violations before canceling the entry in the loan book. The annual meeting of the shareholders was the supreme court of this system, where new books were voted upon and the condition of the collection was reviewed. The census became a formidable instrument of federal governance, a counting of the population that required a massive logistical sweep. The marshal of the district was the officer in charge, who appointed assistant marshals to visit every dwelling. The governance of the census was defined by the schedule, a printed form with columns for specific categories. Free white males of 16 years and upwards, free white males under 16, free white females, all other free persons, and slaves. The assistant marshal carried this paper from door to door. The act of the census required the head of the household to declare the inhabitants of his roof. It was a governance of identity and age. The pasting of the schedule was the final step in the early years. The marshal was required to post the list in 2 public places within the district to allow for corrections. This made the demographics of the town a matter of public record. The ink on these schedules froze the fluid population into a static data set, used to apportion political representation. It was the state claiming knowledge of its human resources. In the southern colonies, the tobacco inspection was the cornerstone of economic governance. Tobacco was not just a crop, it was currency. To prevent the export of trash tobacco, which would ruin the market price, the government established public warehouses at designated shipping points. The planter brought his hogsheads, massive barrels packed with cured leaves, to the warehouse. The inspector was a sworn official. He would break the hogshead, using a tool to pry it open, and remove samples from the top, middle, and bottom. If the tobacco was sound, the inspector branded the hogshead with the name of the warehouse and the net weight. He then issued a tobacco note or crop note. This piece of paper represented the hogshead in the warehouse. These notes circulated as money. A man could pay his taxes, his debts, or his court fees by handing over a sheaf of transfer notes. If the tobacco was condemned, it was burned in the public kiln behind the warehouse. This was a governance of destruction to preserve value. The smoke of the burning trash tobacco was a signal of the rigor of the inspection system. The pilot exercised a specialized governance over the approach to the harbor. The channels were treacherous, shifting with the sands and tides. The branch pilot was a mariner licensed by the state to guide ships into port. He carried a warrant proving his qualification. The governance of the pilotage was a monopoly. Ships of a certain tonnage were required by law to employ a pilot or pay half the fee if they refused. The pilot boat cruised the waters miles offshore, waiting for incoming sails. When a pilot boarded a vessel, the legal command of the ship's navigation transferred from the captain to him. His knowledge of the buoys, beacons, and soundings was the intellectual property of the state, leased to him for a fee. In the dense wooden cities, the fire engine became the center of a volunteer but strictly regulated organization. The engine was a manual pump, a tub on wheels. The company that operated it was a chartered association. The foreman or captain of the engine held absolute authority during a fire. The articles of the company specified the duties. There were hose men who managed the leather hose and brake men who manned the long handles to pump the water. The governance of the engine required monthly maintenance. The steward of the company greased the axles and oiled the leather valves. The engine house was a civic temple where the machine was polished and stored. The competition between engine companies to be the first water on a fire was fierce, but it was a rivalry contained within the structure of municipal ordinances. The chimney sweep was a figure of grime governed by the fear of soot fires. Town bylaws often mandated the cleaning of chimneys at set intervals. The master sweep was licensed and responsible for the conduct of his climbing boys, small children apprenticed to crawl up the flues with brushes and scrapers. The register of sweeps recorded the names of these boys. The sweep would issue a certificate after cleaning, which the householder kept as proof of compliance. If a chimney caught fire and the owner could not produce a recent certificate, the fine was substantial. This was a governance of the invisible interior of the home, enforced by the soot-covered agent of the town. The public common or green was fenced and governed to prevent it from becoming a wasteland. The keeper of the common or a committee of selectmen managed this space. Rules were posted forbidding the dumping of offal, the beating of carpets, or the grazing of certain animals. The planting of trees, particularly elms, became a civic project. The mall was a designated walkway, graveled and lined with trees, designed for the promenade. The governance of the promenade was social. It was a space for the display of order and fashion, but the maintenance of the gravel and the pruning of the branches were paid for by the town treasury. Finally, the patent office began to define the governance of invention. Though still in its infancy, the recording of a letter's patent was a procedure that turned an idea into property. The inventor submitted a specification, a written description, and often a model to the Department of State. The clerk recorded the claim. The letter's patent was a parchment document, signed by high officials and sealed with the seal of the United States, granting the exclusive right to make, use, and sell the invention for 14 years. This was the governance of the mind, a recognition that the mechanical improvements to a plow, a mill, or a nail-making machine were assets as tangible as land, to be measured, described, and protected by the silent weight of the archive. By the dawn of the 19th century, the governance of the American continent had shifted from the organic, winding boundaries of the colonial settlement to the rigid, abstract geometry of the federal grid. The land was no longer defined solely by the ancient oak tree or the meandering brook, but by the imposition of the township and range system. This was a governance of pure mathematics applied to the wilderness. The General Land Office became the central nervous system of this operation, a bureaucracy dedicated to the conversion of territory into squares. The deputy surveyor was the agent of this order. He did not work in the settled towns but on the edge of the known world. His governance was the Gunter's chain, now applied on a continental scale. The survey teams cut a base line running east and west, and a principal meridian running north and south. From the intersection of these two invisible lines, the entire landscape was gridded into 6-mile squares. The surveyor's task was physically exhausting but procedurally exact. He had to set a corner post every mile. In the deep forest or the tall grass of the prairie, he would dig a pit, build a mound of earth, and drive a charred stake into the center. He would then blaze the witness trees, nearby trees marked with the specific township and section numbers cut into the wood, to provide a living reference to the geometric point. The field notes were the narrative of this grid. The surveyor was required to record the quality of the soil, first rate, second rate, or third rate, the species of timber, and the presence of any minerals. These notes were returned to the land office, where draftsmen translated the data into plat maps. The plat was a square diagram representing the township, subdivided into 36 sections of 640 acres each. The governance of the sale relied on this paper. A settler did not buy a beautiful valley. He bought the northeast quarter of Section 8, Township 4 North, Range 3 West. The receiver of public monies sat in the local land office, a small building on the frontier, accepting silver and gold or banknotes in exchange for a patent certificate. This certificate was the seed of a title, a promise that the federal government, with all its archives, guaranteed the ownership of that specific square of earth. As the Industrial Revolution took hold in the river valleys, the governance of labor underwent a radical transformation. The factory system replaced the household loom with the synchronized discipline of the mill. The corporation was the governing body, and the agent was its executive. The mill agent lived in a substantial house near the factory gates, his authority absolute over the operations. The defining instrument of this governance was the factory bell. It hung in a cupola atop the brick mill, distinct from the church bell. Its ringing was a command that regulated the physiology of the workforce. It rang to wake the operatives in the boarding houses, it rang to call them to breakfast, it rang to start the machines, and it rang to release them at night. The timetable was printed and posted on the gate. First bell at 4:30 a.m. Ring out at 6:30 p.m. The boarding house was an extension of the factory's moral and logistical governance. The company built rows of identical houses to shelter the young women recruited from the farms. The boarding house keeper, often a widow of good standing, was employed by the corporation to manage these units. She was responsible for the diet and the conduct of the boarders. The regulations of the boarding house were strict. Doors to be locked at 10 o'clock. No boarders allowed to have company at unseasonable hours. All are expected to attend public worship on the Sabbath. The keeper reported any violation to the agent. A girl dismissed from the mill for misconduct was blacklisted, her name sent to other mills to prevent her re-employment. This was a total governance of life, where the employer provided the bed, the food, the wage, and the rules of behavior. Inside the mill, the overseer walked the aisles of the spinning or weaving rooms. His governance was the slate. He recorded the attendance and the output of each operative. The speed of the work was governed by the main shaft powered by the water wheel, the governor on the steam engine which began to appear later, or the water turbine regulated the consistent flow of power, ensuring the looms beat at a steady rhythm. The air in the room was hot and filled with fly, cotton dust. The windows were often nailed shut to maintain the humidity required for the thread. The shuttle moved back and forth thousands of times a day, a mechanical metronome of production. The paymaster arrived once a month. The payroll was a complex sheet where the board, rent, and food was deducted directly from the wages before the operative received the balance. It was a closed loop of finance. The financial infrastructure of the nation was anchored by the bank. The physical governance of the bank was centered on the vault. This was a masonry room, often lined with iron plates, with a heavy door secured by a complex lock. The cashier was the officer responsible for the vault's integrity. He held the keys. The governance of the bank's daily life revolved around the discount board. The bank existed primarily to discount merchant paper, loaning money, by advancing the face value of a promissory note minus the interest. The board of directors met on specific days to review the offering book, a list of requested loans. They voted on each name by placing a white ball approve or a black ball reject in a box, or simply by marking the book. The banknote itself was a piece of governance. To prevent forgery, the engraving became increasingly intricate, featuring engine-turned geometric lathe work that was impossible to reproduce by hand. The signing of the notes was a tedious duty for the bank president and cashier. Every bill in circulation had to bear their handwritten signatures. The Counterfeit Detector was a periodical publication subscribed to by every merchant and bank. It listed the known bad notes in circulation, describing the flaws. The I's of Washington are crossed, or the N in 5 is crooked. A clerk receiving a bill would consult the detector, governing the transaction by verifying the legitimacy of the paper. The governance of the sea trade evolved into the merchant marine. The core document was the ship's articles. This was a federally mandated contract signed by every sailor before the voyage began. It specified the destination, the wage, and the scale of provisions. 1 pound of beef, 1 pound of bread, half pint of spirits. The articles governed the hierarchy of the ship. To sign the articles was to submit to the maritime law, a harsh code where disobedience could be punished by confinement in irons or, in earlier times, the lash. The logbook was the official record of the vessel's governance. The first mate wrote the entries, the course, the wind, the discipline, and the cargo. In the event of a mutiny or a wreck, the logbook was the primary witness in the Admiralty Court. The custom house grew in complexity. The collector of the port was a powerful federal appointee. The governance of imports involved the bonded warehouse. Merchants who could not pay the duties immediately could store their goods in a government-controlled warehouse. The goods were under bond. The merchant had a key, and the custom house officer had a key. The door could only be opened when both were present. This allowed the state to hold the physical collateral of the tax. The weighers and gaugers on the docks now used standardized federal instruments. Their brass weights periodically sent to the Treasury in Washington for verification. The Post Office Department began to knit the grid together. The post road was a designated route where the mail had priority. The governance of the mail was a system of locks and keys. The mail portmanteau, or leather bag, was secured with a brass padlock. The postmaster at the end of the line had the key. The way bill accompanied the mail, listing the number of letters and the unpaid postage, since postage was often paid by the recipient. The sorting table in the distribution offices was a grid of pigeonholes. The dead letter office in Washington was the final resting place for the failures of the system, letters with illegible addresses or those refused by the addressee. Here, clerks of the dead letter opened and examined the mail to find valuables, a governance of lost communication. The patent office moved from a clerical desk to a dedicated institution. The patent model was a requirement. An inventor had to submit a working miniature of his machine, no larger than 12 inches square. These models were stored in the patent office galleries, a physical museum of ingenuity. The examiner was a new type of bureaucrat, a man of science who reviewed the application against the prior art. He governed the boundary between the known and the new. The issuance of a patent was a grant of a temporary monopoly, a legal fence built around an idea. The apothecary or druggist began to professionalize the governance of medicine. The pharmacopoeia was the standard book of recipes, ensuring that laudanum or calomel was compounded with the same strength in every city. The apothecary's shop was a place of precise measurement. The prescription file was a wire or a book where the written orders of the physicians were impaled or pasted, preserving the history of the treatment. The poison register was a legal requirement in some jurisdictions. A person buying arsenic or opium had to sign their name and state the purpose, a governance of lethal substances. The ice trade introduced the governance of cold. Ice harvested from northern ponds was shipped to the Caribbean and India. This industry relied on the ice house, a double-walled structure insulated with sawdust or charcoal. The ice cutter was a specialized tool, a horse-drawn plow with serrated teeth that scored the frozen surface into perfect squares. The blocks were broken off and floated through channels to the storehouse. The governance of the ice was a battle against thermodynamics. The dunnage of straw and sawdust was packed around the cargo in the ship's hold. The sale of ice was by weight, but the meltage was a calculated loss that had to be factored into the ledger. The livery stable was the rental car agency of the era. Its governance was the day book. A man hiring a horse and buggy had to state his destination and expected return time. The ostler checked the condition of the animal upon return. Overdriving a horse was a civil offense. The stable keeper had a lien on the baggage of a traveler who failed to pay. The smell of ammonia and hay was the backdrop to a system of temporary mobility. The hotel emerged as a commercial evolution of the tavern. The register was the central document every guest had to sign in. The clerk stood behind a counter, acting as the gatekeeper. The hotel had rules posted in the rooms, gas lights to be turned off, not blown out, valuables to be deposited in the safe. The governance of the hotel included the annunciator, a mechanical system of wires and bells connected to the rooms. A guest pulling a cord in room 20 would ring a bell and trip a shutter in the office, signaling the bellboy to attend. This was a mechanical governance of service. The district school was now often governed by a prudential committee in addition to the town committee. The school register recorded not just attendance but deportment. The grading system began to appear, replacing the simple pass-fail of the earlier era. Students were ranked by their recitation marks. The examination day was a public event where the school committee and parents visited to hear the scholars recite. It was an audit of the teacher's performance as much as the students'. The state lunatic asylum represented the governance of insanity. No longer left to the local jail or the attic, the mentally ill were gathered into large, purpose-built institutions. The superintendent was a physician. The governance was moral treatment, a regime of strict routine, labor, and silence. The case book recorded the patient's history, the supposed cause of the malady often listed as religious excitement, intemperance or loss of property, and the daily progress. The architecture itself was a tool of governance, with wards classified by the severity of the illness, the patients moving up or down the halls based on their behavior. The penitentiary introduced the concept of correction through architecture. The Auburn system, or the Pennsylvania system, debated the merits of solitary confinement versus silent group labor. In the silent system, the governance was absolute. Prisoners marched in lockstep, shuffling in unison with hands on the shoulders of the man in front, eyes right. They worked in large shops but were forbidden to speak. The warden governed through the turnkey. The striped suit was the uniform of the governed, stripping away individual identity. The cell block was a multi-tiered hive of steel and stone. The governance of the soul was attempted through the governance of the schedule and the suppression of the voice. The orphan asylum managed the children of the destitute. The indenture was still used, but the institution itself became the guardian. The matron governed the daily life of the children. The admission book recorded the tragic circumstances of arrival: father dead, mother intemperate. The binding out book recorded their departure into apprenticeships. The governance here was a custodial holding pattern, attempting to mold the child into a productive citizen through the regimentation of the bell and the catechism. The savings bank was a new institution designed for the laboring classes. Unlike the commercial bank, it accepted small deposits. Its governance was paternalistic. The passbook was held by the depositor, recording every shilling saved. The bank's charter often restricted how the funds could be invested, usually in safe government bonds or mortgages, to protect the savings of the poor. It was a governance of thrift, encouraging the accumulation of capital through the mechanism of compound interest. The canal boat families lived a life governed by the towpath. The captain of the barge owned the boat and lived in the cabin with his family. The governance of the canal was a linear community. The lock tender controlled the pace. The feed store at the lock provided the supplies. The missionaries who walked the towpath attempted to bring spiritual governance to the floating population, distributing tracts and Bibles to the boatmen who were often outside the reach of the static church. The public library began to shift from subscription models to tax-supported institutions in some progressive towns. The library trustee was the citizen appointed to oversee the collection. The catalog was a handwritten or printed list of the holdings. The governance of the public mind was the goal. The selection of books was carefully curated to exclude immoral fiction and promote useful knowledge. The silence of the reading room was a regulated atmosphere, enforced by the librarian's gaze. The fire insurance company introduced the fire mark. This was a metal plaque attached to the front of a house, indicating that the property was insured. The governance of risk was the business model. The company employed surveyors to inspect properties before insuring them. They noted the construction, brick, wood, slate roof, and the proximity to hazardous trades. The map of the city began to be color-coded by the insurance cartographers, creating a governance of the city's flammability. The Board of Health in the cities became a permanent body, no longer just for emergencies. They governed the nuisances. The night soil men were licensed to empty the privies. This work was restricted to the hours of darkness. The scavengers were employed to sweep the streets. The governance of filth was a logistical operation involving carts and designated dumping grounds. The death rate was calculated, and the bills of mortality were published, a statistical governance of the city's hygiene. The Mechanics' Institute offered a governance of self-improvement for the skilled tradesmen. These were associations that provided lectures and libraries. The lecture hall was the venue for the dissemination of science and art. The ticket to the lecture series was a badge of aspiration. The governance of the institute was democratic, with officers elected from the membership, a parallel civic structure focused on the elevation of the technical class. The auction house became a permanent fixture for the trade of imported goods. The catalog of the sale was printed in advance. The auctioneer governed the bidding with a rhythm that drove the price. The fall of the hammer was the binding contract. The clerk recorded the buyer and the price. The governance of the auction was the governance of the instant market, clearing the warehouse of British textiles or Chinese tea in a single afternoon of regulated noise. These systems, the surveyor's chain, the factory bell, the bank vault, the ship's articles, the patent model, and the asylum ward, were the infrastructure of a maturing nation. The governance was no longer just about maintaining the peace. It was about managing the flow of people, money, and goods through a standardized, documented, and timed environment. The grid on the map was reflected in the grid of the ledger and the grid of the city streets, a world where every action had a corresponding record. As the 19th century progressed into its middle decades, the governance of the American environment descended beneath the surface of the streets and ascended into the wires strung above the rooftops. The era of visible, surface-level management, the fence viewer walking the field or the surveyor dragging his chain, was supplemented by the administration of invisible flows: gas, water, and electricity. The city became a machine that required a new class of operators to regulate its internal pressures and currents. The gas works established a governance of light that operated on an industrial scale. The gasometer was the physical heart of this system, a colossal telescoping tank that rose and fell with the volume of coal gas produced. The superintendent of the works monitored the retorts where coal was baked to release its vapor. The governance of the distribution relied on the main, the network of iron pipes buried in the earth. The map of the mains was a guarded document detailing the location of every valve and junction. For the consumer, the governance of light was mediated by the gas meter. This sealed metal box, often located in the cellar, contained a mechanism of bellows and dials that measured the cubic feet of gas consumed. The meter reader was the agent of the company who visited the home monthly. He carried a lantern and a book, recording the position of the hands on the dials. The gas bill was a calculation derived from this reading. The lamplighter was the public face of this system. He followed a strict route at dusk, carrying a ladder and a torch. His duty was to open the valve on the street lamp and ignite the jet. At dawn, he retraced his steps to extinguish them. The city paid for this service by the lamp power. A defective burner that hissed or flickered was a breach of contract, reported by the police or the citizens to the gas company. Simultaneously, the waterworks introduced a hydraulic governance to the urban center. The aqueduct was a man-made river governed by gravity and engineering. The reservoir was the holding tank, a stone fortress of water. The gatehouse controlled the flow from the aqueduct into the city. The gatekeeper operated the massive iron sluice gates, regulating the water level based on the demand. The Croton Maid, or similar symbolic figures, often decorated the fountains, but the reality was a system of lead and iron pipes. The hydrant became the interface for fire protection, replacing the river and the cistern. The stopcock was the valve that allowed the water to be shut off for repairs. The governance of water usage was strict. The water rate was often based on the frontage of the building or the number of stories, not just the volume used. The water commissioner employed inspectors to check for leaks. A wasting of water was a finable offense. In winter, the governance required the water to be kept moving to prevent freezing, leading to the running of taps, which the authorities struggled to regulate. The plumber emerged as a licensed tradesman, the only person authorized to tap into the main. He had to file a permit with the water department before opening the street. The railroad imposed a governance of steel and time that superseded the rhythms of the turnpike. The timetable was the supreme law of the line. It was a printed grid of stations and minutes. The conductor was the captain of the train, distinguished by his uniform and his heavy pocket watch. The governance of the watch was critical. Conductors were required to compare their timepieces with the standard clock at the terminal station before every departure. The dispatcher sat in a telegraph office, controlling the movement of trains on the single track. He issued train orders, written on thin tissue paper, which gave a specific train the right to the track over another. The waybill governed the freight. Every box, bale, and barrel loaded onto a car was entered on this manifest. The freight agent at the depot was responsible for the weighing and billing. The classification of freight determined the rate: first class for furniture, fourth class for coal. The brakeman was the laborer of motion. He stood on the roof of the swaying cars, exposed to the weather, turning the brake wheels on command from the engineer's whistle. The switchman governed the junctions, physically moving the rails to divert a train from the main line to a siding. His error could mean disaster, so his station was often a small shanty by the tracks where he waited for the signal. The telegraph created a governance of instantaneous information. The telegraph office was a quiet room filled with the clicking of the sounder. The operator was a skilled technician who knew the Morse code by ear. The governance of the message was the telegram. The sender wrote his message on a form, counting the words, as the cost was calculated per word and by distance. The operator translated the script into electrical pulses. The receiving operator at the distant station translated the clicks back into script. The messenger boy was the final link, running the envelope to the recipient. The cipher was used by banks and governments to govern secrecy, a code within a code. The wires themselves were property, protected by law. To cut a telegraph wire was a felony. In the financial districts, the stock exchange formalized the governance of capital. The board was a room where the brokers gathered. The governance was the call. The president of the exchange would read through the list of stocks: New York Central, Erie, Western Union. As each name was called, the brokers shouted their bids and offers. The secretary recorded the transactions. The seat on the exchange was a membership that granted the right to trade. It was a form of property that could be bought and sold. The ticker, introduced later, mechanized the governance of price. It printed the stock symbols and prices on a continuous ribbon of paper tape. The tape became the authoritative record of value, flowing out to the brokerage houses. The professional police force replaced the old watch system with a paramilitary governance of the streets. The chief of police commanded a hierarchy of captains, sergeants, and patrolmen. The precinct was the geographical unit of command. The station house was the headquarters. The governance of the officer was defined by the rule book and the uniform. The star or shield was the badge of authority, pinned to the left breast. The roll call began every shift, where the men were inspected for sobriety and neatness. The police blotter was the ledger of disorder. The desk sergeant recorded every arrest: the name, the alias, the crime, and the listing of property found on the person. The governance of identification began to use science. The rogues gallery was a collection of daguerreotypes or ambrotypes, photographs of known criminals. These images were kept in a cabinet, allowing detectives to study the faces of the professionals. The telegraph connected the precincts, allowing the description of a fugitive to be flashed across the city. The beat was the territory of the patrolman, a specific loop of streets he was required to walk at a steady pace, trying doors and observing corners. The omnibus and later the horse car introduced the governance of urban transit. The stage was a box on wheels pulled by horses on rails. The conductor on the car collected the fare, often 5 cents. To prevent theft, the company introduced the bell punch. When the conductor received a nickel, he punched a hole in a ticket, and the punch rang a bell. The register on the wall of the car counted the passengers. The bell must ring for every fare was the rule. The starter stood at the terminal, timing the departure of the cars to ensure they were spaced evenly along the line. The company rules governed the passengers. No smoking, no profane language, no head or arms out the window. The governance of immigration became a mass processing operation, epitomized by depots like Castle Garden. The commissioners of immigration oversaw the arrival of thousands. The ship dropped anchor and the passengers were ferried to the depot. The governance here was a sieve. The medical examiner watched the immigrants as they walked, looking for signs of lameness, blindness, or fever. The registry clerk sat at a high desk, recording the name, age, place of origin, and destination. The labor exchange within the depot attempted to connect the new arrival with employment. The money changer was a licensed broker who converted foreign coin, thalers, francs, sovereigns into dollars. The governance of the baggage was a massive logistical task. The baggage master issued brass checks for trunks and bundles. The goal was to process the humanity efficiently, filtering out the likely to become a public charge, and sending the healthy workforce onto the trains to the interior. The assay office was the federal governance of gold. Miners and merchants brought their raw dust, nuggets, and foreign coins to the counter. The assayer melted the metal in a crucible, removing impurities. He then tested a sample to determine the fineness, the parts per thousand of pure gold. The metal was cast into ingots or bars, stamped with the seal of the United States, the weight, and the fineness. The depositor received the value in coin or a check. This was the chemical verification of wealth, turning the chaotic find of the prospector into the standardized currency of the nation. The Weather Bureau, initially a network of observers organized by the Smithsonian and later the Signal Service, began to govern the understanding of the sky. The observer at a remote station read the barometer, the thermometer, and the wind gauge at specific synchronized hours. He telegraphed the data to Washington. The weather map was constructed from these reports, drawing isobars, lines of equal pressure, to predict the movement of storms. The signal flags, square flags of red, white, and blue, were hoisted at ports and rail stations to warn of approaching gales or cold waves. This was a governance of warning, an attempt to protect commerce from the elements through the aggregation of data. The Department of the Interior managed the Indian agencies. The agent lived on the reservation, managing the distribution of annuities, goods promised by treaty. The beef issue was a grim logistical event where cattle were distributed to the tribes. The governance here was a record of rations, blankets, flour, and coffee. The census of the tribe was taken to determine the allocation. The school on the reservation was a tool of cultural governance, where attendance was enforced and English was the mandatory language. The public school in the city evolved into a graded system governed by the superintendent of schools. The curriculum was standardized. The textbook was uniform across the district. The examination was the gate between grades. The truant officer was a specialized policeman for the education system. He patrolled the streets during school hours, looking for children of school age. He had the legal authority to arrest a truant and return him to the school or take him to a reform school. The report card was the monthly accounting sent to the parents, recording scholarship, deportment, and attendance. The fire department transitioned from the volunteer clubs to a paid municipal force. The steam fire engine was the machine that drove this change. It was heavy, complex, and required a professional engineer to maintain the boiler pressure. The fire alarm telegraph was installed on street corners, the red box. A citizen pulling the hook sent a coded signal to the central office, which then tapped out the box number on the bells of the firehouses. The governance of the response was measured in seconds. The horses were trained to run from their stalls to the pole at the sound of the gong. The harness was suspended from the ceiling, dropping onto the horses' backs to save time. The hospital became a place of medical governance, distinct from the almshouse. The admitting physician triaged the patients. The ward was the unit of organization. The head nurse managed the order of the room. The chart at the foot of the bed recorded the temperature, pulse, and medication. The operating theater was a space of surgical governance, where the new anesthetic procedures, ether and chloroform, were administered. The ambulance service, equipped with a surgeon and splints, brought the governance of emergency care to the street. The cemetery evolved into the rural cemetery, a landscaped park on the outskirts of the city. The governance of the dead was managed by the Cemetery Corporation. The plot was private property, evidenced by a deed. The Perpetual Care Fund was a financial instrument where the interest on a deposit paid for the cutting of the grass forever. The rules of the cemetery forbade fast driving of carriages, the picking of flowers, and the entry of dogs. The gatekeeper enforced the hours of visitation. The burial permit, issued by the Board of Health, was the ticket of admission for the hearse. The public library introduced the card catalog. The governance of the book collection moved from the ledger to the index card, allowing for infinite expansion. The Dewey Decimal System, or similar classification schemes, assigned a number to every subject of human knowledge. The book was shelved according to this number. The call slip was filled out by the patron and handed to the page, who retrieved the book from the closed stacks. The governance of the library was a governance of silence and classification, ordering the intellectual output of the civilization into rows of accessible spines. The department store revolutionized the governance of retail. The floorwalker was the monitor of the aisles, directing customers and overseeing the clerks. The price tag replaced the haggle. The price was fixed and visible. The cash railway or pneumatic tube system moved money from the counter to the cashier's office in the basement. The clerk placed the customer's money, and the sales slip into a cup or carrier, which shot through a tube to the central office. Change and a receipt were returned the same way. This centralized the governance of cash, removing temptation from the sales floor and creating a perfect audit trail of every handkerchief and glove sold. The elevator or vertical railway allowed the city to rise. The operator stood in the cage controlling the lever. The governance of the elevator involved the safety brake. The indicator showed the floor. The operator called out the floors and the departments found on them. The capacity of the car was posted. Maximum load 1,500 pounds. The vertical governance of the building required the janitor, or superintendent, to manage the boiler in the basement that generated the steam to lift the cars. The photography studio offered a governance of memory. The sitter was placed in a head rest to ensure immobility during the long exposure. The plate was prepared with chemicals in the darkroom. The governance of the image was the negative. From one negative, multiple prints could be made. The album became the repository of the family history, a standardized book with slots for the carte de visite photographs. The face of the individual was captured, standardized in size, and filed away, a visual census of the private circle. These systems, the gas meter, the train order, the stock ticker, the fire alarm, the pneumatic tube, and the elevator brake, created a world where the flow of life was regulated by mechanical and electrical devices. The governance was no longer just a matter of law, but of physics and engineering. The citizen moved through a landscape of pipes, wires, and rails, guided by the bell, the whistle, and the dial, participating in a vast, silent coordination of energy and information. By the closing years of the 19th century, the governance of American life had coalesced into a dense, inescapable tapestry of standardized time, mechanized record-keeping, and professionalized expertise. The local, face-to-face administration of the colonial meeting house had been fully subsumed by the Bureau, a specialized department for every conceivable function of society. The typewriter and the filing cabinet became the new engines of order, transforming the slow, unique scrawl of the clerk into a uniform, replicable, and vertically integrated archive. The office itself was the cathedral of this new governance. The architecture of the skyscraper was a vertical filing system for human labor. The time clock stood at the entrance, a mechanical sentry. Each employee had a card. Upon arrival and departure, they inserted the card into a slot and pulled a lever. The machine stamped the exact minute in purple ink. This was the punch-in, a ritual that converted a person's presence into payroll data. The governance of the workday was no longer about the sun or the task, but about the accumulation of stamped hours. The manager sat in a private office, separated by glass, overseeing the rows of desks where clerks and stenographers processed the paper flow. The typewriter introduced a percussive rhythm to the production of law and commerce. The typist was a new specialist, her fingers memorizing the QWERTY keyboard. The machine produced legible, identical characters. The carbon paper allowed for the simultaneous creation of copies, the original, the duplicate, and the triplicate. The governance of the file relied on this multiplicity. One copy went to the client, one to the accounting department, and one to the central files. The manila folder and the vertical file allowed these papers to be stored on edge, accessible by tabs. The index card system cross-referenced the files, creating a physical database that could be searched by name, number, or subject. The telephone brought the governance of the voice into the office. The switchboard was the nerve center, operated by women who plugged brass jacks into a honeycomb of holes to connect the lines. The directory was the public register of this network. The governance of the call was immediate but mediated. The private branch exchange, PBX, allowed a company to have its own internal switching system. The long-distance call was a premium event, timed by the operator and billed by the minute. The voice traveling over the copper wire was a command that bypassed the delay of the mail. The department store refined the governance of consumption into a science. The cash register was the machine of the transaction. It had keys for dollars and cents. When a sale was rung up, a bell chimed, a drawer shot open, and a tab popped up in the window showing the amount. This visible audit prevented pilfering. The sales slip was written by the clerk, listing the item and the price. The inventory was a constant process of counting stock. The buyer governed the selection of goods, traveling to wholesale markets to procure the seasonal lines. The credit department managed the charge account. The customer was issued a metal coin or token with their account number. The pneumatic tube whisked the credit slip to the basement where a clerk checked the customers standing in the ledger before authorizing the sale. The hospital became a fortress of sterile governance. The germ theory dictated the rituals of the operating room. The surgeon scrubbed his hands for a timed duration. The autoclave used high-pressure steam to sterilize instruments, a governance of invisible life. The medical record followed the patient from admission to discharge. The nurse charted the vital signs on a graph: temperature, pulse, respiration. The pharmacy in the basement dispensed medication in unit doses, counted and labeled. The morgue was the final station, where the death certificate was signed, stating the immediate cause and underlying cause, creating the statistics of public health. The public school solidified the governance of the child. The grade was now a rigid ladder from 1st to 12th. The report card was sent home every term, a grid of letters or numbers evaluating scholarship and effort. The standardized test began to appear, a printed exam identical for all students, scored by a key. The Pledge of Allegiance was a daily ritual of civic governance, recited in unison with the hand over the heart. The school board set the curriculum, purchasing textbooks that defined the authorized version of history and science. The bell rang to change classes, moving the student body through the halls in a synchronized tide. The railroad consolidated into massive systems. The Union Station was a monumental gateway to the city. The Board of Information was a chalkboard or mechanical display listing arrivals and departures. The Pullman car offered a governance of luxury travel. The porter managed the sleeping berths, converting the seats into beds with a practiced efficiency. The dining car was a restaurant on wheels, governed by the steward and the reservation. The ticket was a long strip of paper, punched by the conductor for each leg of the journey. The interchange of freight cars between railroads was governed by the car service rules, tracking the location of every boxcar on the continent and charging demurrage for delays. The post office introduced rural free delivery, RFD, extending the governance of the mail to the isolated farm. The mailbox by the road became the terminal of the federal network. The postal money order allowed for the secure transfer of funds through the mail. The parcel post brought the mail order catalog into the home. The Sears, Roebuck, or Montgomery Ward catalog was a book of dreams, governing the material aspirations of the rural family. The customer filled out an order form, calculated the shipping weight, and sent the money. The goods arrived by rail and wagon, a standardized consumption available to all. The Census Bureau adopted the holorith machine to govern the data of the population. The census taker recorded the information. Then, key punch operators transferred the data onto punch cards, punching holes in specific locations to represent age, race, occupation, and origin. These cards were fed into the tabulating machine, which used electrical contacts to count the holes. This was the first automated governance of statistics, allowing the government to cross-tabulate millions of lives in weeks rather than years. The City Beautiful movement brought a governance of aesthetics to the urban landscape. The Park Commission designed boulevards and parkways. The zoning law began to separate the city into residential, commercial, and industrial districts. The building code dictated the height, materials, and safety features of construction. The fire escape was a mandatory iron appendage on the tenement. The plumbing code required traps and vents to prevent sewer gas from entering the home. The city was no longer a chaotic growth, but a planned organism, governed by the master plan. The labor union emerged as a counter-governance to the corporation. The union card was the badge of membership. The shop steward was the representative on the floor. The collective bargaining agreement was the treaty between capital and labor, specifying wages, hours, and grievance procedures. The strike was the withdrawal of labor, a collective action governed by the vote of the membership. The picket line defined the boundary of the dispute. The police department professionalized detection. The Bertillon system of body measurements, caliper readings of the head, ear, and finger, was used to identify repeat offenders, soon to be replaced by the fingerprint. The police box on the street corner allowed the patrolman to ring in to the station every hour. The Black Maria, or paddy wagon, was the vehicle of arrest. The lineup allowed witnesses to view suspects under bright lights. The governance of crime became a system of files, prints, and photographs. The Library of Congress became the central repository of the nation's intellectual property. The Copyright Office received 2 copies of every book, map, and piece of music published. The card catalog, printed by the library, was distributed to local libraries, standardizing the organization of knowledge across the country. The copyright date on the title page established the legal lifespan of the author's ownership. The weather was now governed by the United States Weather Bureau. The daily weather map was printed and mailed to post offices and rail stations. The forecast was a prediction issued for specific regions. The kite station sent instruments aloft to measure the upper atmosphere. The governance of the sky was a matter of collecting data from hundreds of stations and reducing it to a single probability. The national park introduced the governance of wilderness preservation. The park ranger was the guardian of the land, enforcing rules against hunting and logging. The Yellowstone, or Yosemite, was no longer wild land but public land set aside by an act of Congress. The tourist followed a guidebook, viewing the geysers and canyons from designated viewpoints. The governance of nature was a paradox, protecting the wild by regulating the human experience of it. The electrical grid powered the city. The power station generated the current with massive dynamos. The substation stepped down the voltage. The meter on the house measured the kilowatt hours. The fuse box protected the circuit. The electric chair introduced a technological governance of capital punishment, a sterile execution by switch and current. The automobile began to appear, bringing a new chaos that would soon require its own governance. The license plate, the driver's license, and the speed limit. But for now, it was the bicycle that had paved the way for good roads, leading to the asphalt paving of city streets. In the home, the sewing machine governed the production of clothes, a mechanical aid that increased the speed of the needle. The icebox was a standard appliance, serviced by the iceman who looked for the card in the window indicating the weight required, 25, 50, or 75 pounds. The gas range replaced the hearth. The clock on the mantel was mass-produced, a ticker of the standardized time that now ruled the school, the factory, and the train. The governance of the self was aided by the insurance policy. The life insurance agent sold a contract that placed a value on the breadwinner's life. The premium was paid monthly. The actuary calculated the risk based on mortality tables. The beneficiary was the designated recipient. It was a financial governance of death, providing a safety net for the widow and orphan through the pooling of risk. The voting machine began to replace the paper ballot. The voter entered a curtained booth and pulled levers for their chosen candidates. The counter inside the machine tallied the votes mechanically. This was a governance of the franchise intended to eliminate fraud and speed the count. By the end of the century, the American citizen lived within a matrix of paper, steel, and wire. From the birth certificate filed in the municipal clerk's office to the death certificate in the Bureau of Vital Statistics, the life of the individual was a tracked, measured, and recorded trajectory. The passport became necessary for travel abroad. The bank book defined financial standing. The deed defined the home. The diploma defined education. The professional license defined the right to work as a doctor, lawyer, or plumber. The silence of the early settlement, broken only by the lowing of cattle and the ringing of the meeting house bell, had been replaced by the hum of the dynamo, the clatter of the typewriter, the ring of the telephone, and the tick of the clock. Order was no longer a local agreement among neighbors. It was a national system of systems, a vast, interlocking machine of governance that processed the raw material of a continent and the energy of its people into a predictable, documented, and insurable civilization. The design was complete. The wilderness had been measured, the river dammed, the time standardized, and the citizen filed. The waiting was over. The modern world had arrived.